Hello there, and welcome, where curiosity settles in for the evening, and the world's stranger corners are explored at a pace slow enough to rest with. Tonight's journey takes us onto one of the most famous footpaths in the world, a narrow line of dirt, stone, roots, mud, and stubborn reputation that runs along the eastern United States for more than 2,000 miles. The Appalachian Trail is often spoken about with a certain kind of awe, and not without reason. It winds through forests, crosses ridgelines, disappears into fog, climbs mountains, and pulls people into a long conversation with weather, distance, hunger, sore knees, and their own thoughts. It is beautiful. It is historic. It is for many people a dream. And yet, for all its postcard charm and outdoor legend, there are stretches of this trail that even experienced hikers approach with caution, delay, dread, or in some cases a very firm decision to avoid altogether. That may sound a little odd at first. After all, a hiking trail is meant to be walked. That is rather the whole point. It is not called the Appalachian Glancing Path or the Appalachian perhaps another time route. It is a trail. It is there. People lace up boots, shoulder packs, and set out to follow it. And still, among those who know it well, certain names carry a particular tone when they are spoken out loud. Not always fear, exactly. Sometimes it is irritation, sometimes respect, sometimes the flat, practical voice of someone remembering a miserable day involving soaked socks, bruised feet, a steep descent, and one regrettable snack choice. There are sections where the terrain turns slow and punishing. There are places where weather can shift from manageable to dangerous in a matter of hours. There are ridges that look lovely in a photograph and become much less charming once you are climbing them with 30 pounds on your back and a thunderstorm rolling in from the west. So tonight, we are going to walk into that quieter side of the legend. Not the version polished for tourism brochures, not the version told by people who have only seen the trail in autumn calendars, with bright leaves and cheerful sunshine. We're going to look at why a trail so admired can also be so deeply avoided in places, and why some of its most famous miles are known not for ease or serenity, but for exhaustion, injury, weather, remoteness, and the kind of mental fatigue that turns a simple hill into a private crisis. Because the Appalachian Trail is not difficult in one single way. It does not challenge everyone with the same obstacle. For some, the problem is rock. For others, heat. For others, isolation. For others, the maddening slowness of a route that seems, mile after mile, to enjoy proving that a map can be technically accurate while emotionally dishonest. Before we get into all that, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what kind of landscape rests outside your door right now. Are you in a city apartment with traffic murmuring below, in a quiet suburb where everything has gone still, or somewhere rural where the dark beyond the window feels deep and uninterrupted? And if you happen to know the time, that feels fitting too, because trails have a way of changing your relationship with the clock. A single mile can pass quickly on flat ground, while one steep, wet, rock-strewn climb can stretch into what feels like an entire separate lifetime. If this kind of slow wandering through history, landscape, and the stranger details of the world helps you unwind, I would be ever so grateful if you liked the video and maybe subscribed as well. It helps this calm little corner find the people who need it, particularly those who enjoy learning about difficult things from the comfort of a chair, a blanket, and a far safer level of elevation. And that really is one of life's better arrangements. It is very satisfying to study suffering from a position that includes dry socks and unrestricted access to tea. Now then, let us ease our way onto the trail. The Appalachian Trail, often simply called the AT, stretches from Springer Mountain in Georgia to Mount Katahdin in Maine. or the other way round, depending on where one begins and how stubborn one is about direction. It passes through 14 states and crosses terrain that changes constantly in character, climate and mood. In some places it feels accessible, almost sociable, with shelters, road crossings, and a steady trickle of fellow hikers. In other places it becomes rougher, lonelier, slower, and less forgiving. The trail has a way of resisting the neat assumptions people bring to it. Those who imagine one long woodland stroll are corrected quickly. Those who expect every mile to be equally hard are corrected as well. The Appalachian Trail is not one experience. It is a chain of very different experiences stitched together under one famous name. That difference matters because when people hear that certain sections are avoided, they sometimes imagine some dramatic forbidden zone, some haunted ravine where every hiker turns pale and backs away, while a raven circles overhead for effect. The truth is both less theatrical and more interesting. These places are avoided for practical reasons. They are hard on the body, they are hard on gear, they are hard on morale. They may not offer enough water in hot weather. They may be notorious for sharp rocks that pound the feet. They may involve long, steep climbs that become dangerous in rain or ice. They may simply slow progress so much that hikers on a tight schedule choose alternate plans. Sometimes the choice to avoid a section is not cowardice. It is logistics. Sometimes it is pain management. Sometimes it's a seasoned hiker looking at a map, remembering what came last time, and deciding that life is too short to repeat a particular misery voluntarily. That last part may sound unromantic, but trails have a way of stripping romance down to what can actually be carried uphill. The Appalachian Trail has inspired books, documentaries, trail names, personal reinventions, and a whole culture of long-distance walking. People set out to thru-hike the entire route in one season. Others tackle it in sections over years. Some walk a weekend, some attempt a month. Some leave after a week with fresh respect for anyone who makes it farther. The dream is large, but the reality is granular. A full day on trail is not made of legend. It is made of steps. Thousands and thousands of steps. Wet leaves, a slipped heel, a climb that looks shorter on paper, a shelter full of snoring, a water source that runs thinner than expected, a pair of shoes that began the trip cheerful and now feel like two collapsing arguments strapped to your feet. And still people love it. That is the important thing. The hardship does not erase the appeal. In some ways, it creates it. Difficulty gives the trail its reputation, and reputation draws people in. There is a certain human tendency to hear that something is hard and immediately begin imagining oneself as the kind of person who handles it well. This is not unique to hikers. It appears in runners, climbers, language learners, home cooks attempting bread that requires 17 unnecessary acts of devotion, and anyone who has ever watched a documentary and thought, yes, that looks transformative, I should probably suffer nobly in that exact setting. The Appalachian Trail attracts that impulse, but then tests it against daily reality. Reality on this trail is shaped first by terrain. The Appalachian Mountains are old, but old does not mean gentle. This is one of the first misunderstandings newcomers run into. The mountains are not alpine in the western sense. Many are heavily forested. Their elevations are often lower than the giants out west. On paper, that can seem reassuring. But the AT does not generally believe in soft introductions or gradual convenience. It is notorious for climbs that go straight up slopes without the kind of switchbacks that preserve energy and maintain optimism. It often descends the same way. That means long days of repeated elevation change, sharp footing, and constant wear on knees and ankles. A mountain does not have to be enormous to be exhausting. It simply has to be steep, badly timed, and followed by another one. Then there is the surface underfoot. Dirt path sounds friendly. Dirt path sounds reasonable. Dirt path sounds like something a healthy person in a tasteful outdoor advertisement crosses while smiling lightly and carrying a backpack that appears to contain nothing heavier than a folded scarf. Large portions of the Appalachian Trail are not that. They are rooty, rocky, muddy, uneven, and occasionally inclined to become streams. In some sections, the footing is so rough that progress slows to a crawl. In others, the rocks are small but relentless, sharp enough and numerous enough to bruise soles hour after hour. A hiker can cover a great many miles in one kind of terrain and then find that on another stretch the same distance feels almost absurd. That is one reason names begin to matter so much on the trail. Particular sections build reputations because word spreads. A shelter log mentions bad footing. A thru-hiker groans at the mention of a state line. Someone in town says, "Enjoy the next bit," with the tone of a person offering sincere sympathy disguised as encouragement. Over time, certain places become known not simply as scenic or historic, but as punishing. Sometimes that punishment is physical. Sometimes it is psychological. The two, of course, are close friends. Psychological strain on a long trail is often underestimated by people who do not spend much time outdoors for days at a stretch. There is an assumption that being in nature is automatically soothing, and certainly it can be. A quiet forest in the early morning can feel wonderfully steadying. The smell of pine after rain does not usually make things worse. But prolonged hiking is not a spa treatment conducted at boot level. The same woods that look peaceful in daylight can feel oppressive when fog settles in, when miles are passing too slowly, when your legs are done for the day and you still have not reached water, or when every step requires concentration because the rocks have decided to conduct a private campaign against your joints. What hikers avoid is not always danger in the dramatic sense. Often it is the accumulation of strain. Enough of that, and a section becomes notorious even if it is technically survivable, which most of them are, provided one respects them. Respect is a recurring theme with the Appalachian Trail because the gap between image and experience is so wide. This trail has been photographed, written about, celebrated and mythologized for generations. It appears in stories of self-discovery and endurance. It represents escape, challenge, solitude, and continuity. It carries history in a very direct way, not only because it is old as a route, but because it threads through regions with long relationships to land, weather, labour, settlement, and movement. To walk the AT is not simply to go hiking. It is to join a stream of people who have each brought different expectations and met the trail on its own terms. Some found joy, some found blisters, many found both by lunchtime, and this is where the avoided sections become especially interesting. They reveal the trail as it is rather than as it is marketed or imagined. The difficult section acts like a truth serum. It shows what matters when comfort drops away. It reveals how quickly enthusiasm can become arithmetic, how much water is left, how far to shelter, how many daylight hours remain, whether the knees can manage another descent, whether the weather report was optimistic or merely rude, whether pride is helping or hindering. Experienced hikers tend to think in these terms because experience teaches caution. That is why those who know the trail best are sometimes the very ones most willing to skip, reroute, wait out, or otherwise avoid certain sections. They are not less committed, they are more informed. There is also the issue of season. The Appalachian Trail changes dramatically depending on when it is walked. A section that is manageable in dry weather may become treacherous in rain. A ridge that feels brisk and pleasant in autumn may be dangerously exposed in winter. Mud, ice, heat, storms, insects, leaf cover, and water levels all affect what a hiker faces. Timing can turn a hard section into a miserable one, or a miserable one into something that borders on reckless. When hikers choose to avoid certain areas, they're often responding to the specific conditions of that year, that month, or even that week. There is no single Appalachian Trail. There are many versions of it shaped by season and circumstance. Then there is the body itself, which never remains a neutral machine for long. Feet swell, knees ache, shoulders complain, appetite changes. Sleep becomes oddly precious and oddly fragile. The same person who feels strong in one state may feel depleted in the next. That matters because a trail section is not encountered in isolation. No one steps fresh from their living room directly into the roughest mile on the AT. They bring with them accumulated fatigue, weather exposure, small injuries, morale, and whatever happened earlier that day or week. A notorious section near the beginning of a hike feels one way. The same section after hundreds of miles feels quite another. Sometimes avoidance is the sensible decision of a tired human being who understands that there is a difference between challenge and stubborn self-sabotage. Of course, not every difficult section is avoided by everybody. Some hikers seek them out precisely because they are famous. There is a trail culture around testing oneself, around earning certain miles, around being able to say that yes, it was every bit as rough as promised, and perhaps worse. But even among strong hikers, there is often an honesty about what these places demand. You hear it in the practical language they use. They do not always say a section is terrifying. They say it is slow. They say it is brutal on the feet. They say the descent is no joke. They say weather up there can get ugly fast. They say you do not want to hit that stretch late in the day. That kind of understatement is worth listening to. Outdoor people often become calm talkers precisely because they prefer not to waste energy on theatrical language. If a veteran hiker says a stretch is rough, it is usually rough. And perhaps that is part of what makes the Appalachian Trail so enduring as a subject. It contains both invitation and warning in the same narrow path. It offers beauty, community, and deep satisfaction. But it never fully lets you forget that walking across mountains for months is a hard thing to do. There are no bonus points awarded by the universe for underestimating it. The trail does not care whether someone arrived inspired by romance, fitness, curiosity, grief, reinvention, or a very enthusiastic social media montage. It answers everyone in the same language eventually, and that language is terrain. So as we begin this slow walk through the sections that people hesitate to face, skip when they can, or remember with a kind of respectful annoyance, it helps to keep one simple truth in mind. Avoidance on the Appalachian Trail is not always about fear. Sometimes it is the clearest sign of experience. Sometimes it is how hikers show respect for weather, for their bodies, for timing, and for the stubborn realities of wild land. And once you understand that, the trail begins to come into focus not as a single heroic line on a map, but as a collection of very specific places, each with its own demands, reputation, and ways of humbling whoever comes through. To understand why those places became so talked about, and why this long footpath turned from ambitious idea into one of the most famous hikes on Earth, it helps to go back a little, to the making of the trail itself, because legends do not begin as legends. They begin as plans, arguments, blisters, and somebody, somewhere, looking at a long line of mountains and deciding that people ought to try walking across them. That impulse, simple as it sounds, is where the Appalachian Trail begins to take shape. not first as a line on the ground, but as an idea in a human mind. And like many ambitious ideas, it started with someone looking at a complicated world and proposing a long walk as part of the answer. In the early 20th century, the United States was changing quickly. Cities were growing, industry was expanding, work was becoming more crowded, more mechanical, and for many people more disconnected from the rhythms of weather, land, and open space. This was not a new problem exactly. Human beings have been inventing ways to make life noisier and more stressful for quite some time. But by the 1920s, there was a growing interest in outdoor recreation, conservation, and the idea that modern life needed some kind of counterbalance. National parks were gaining prestige, hiking clubs were forming, scenic roads, camps, and forest preserves were being discussed not merely as luxuries, but as part of a healthier society. Into that atmosphere stepped Benton MacKaye, the man most often credited with imagining the Appalachian Trail into existence. MacKaye was not simply a hiker with a fondness for views. He was a forester, planner and thinker with a broad social vision. In 1921, he published an article proposing a trail along the Appalachian Mountains, a long-distance footpath stretching through the eastern United States. But he did not present it only as a recreation project. He imagined something larger, a kind of green refuge from the pressures of industrial life. The trail, in his vision, would connect wilderness, camps, communities, and places for rest and renewal. He thought of it as part footpath, part social remedy, part environmental planning. That may sound very lofty, and it was. But many large practical things begin with someone being just idealistic enough to sound slightly unreasonable at first. MacKaye's idea arrived at the right time. Hiking clubs already existed across parts of the Appalachian Range, especially in the northeast. These groups had built and maintained local trails, shelters, and mountain paths for their own use. What MacKaye proposed was not creating a love of hiking from nothing. It was linking what already existed and expanding it into something far bigger. Instead of isolated paths, there could be one continuous route. Instead of separate local efforts, there could be a shared undertaking. The brilliance of the idea was partly in its scale, but also in the way it invited cooperation. The Appalachian Trail would not be built by one person or one agency sweeping grandly across 14 states with a map and heroic music in the background. It would come together in pieces, club by club, ridge by ridge, section by section. That, in fact, is one reason the trail became legendary. It was not simply imposed. It was assembled through persistence. Local hiking clubs blazed sections, cleared paths, built shelters, marked routes, and argued over details that must have seemed at times both vitally important and deeply exhausting. Any long trail requires someone to decide where it should go, and that process is less romantic than people often imagine. It involves land access, private property, volunteer labour, negotiations, maintenance, weather damage, and the constant discovery that nature has no intention of preserving a neat footpath out of courtesy. Trees fall, floods wash out sections, brush grows, mud expands with the confidence of an empire. To keep a trail alive requires regular work, and the Appalachian Trail from the beginning depended on people willing to do that work without much glamour attached. The first major organised push came with the formation of the Appalachian Trail Conference in 1925, now known as the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. That organisation helped coordinate the many groups involved, giving structure to a project that might otherwise have remained a collection of good intentions and regional enthusiasm. Coordination matters in a trail that crosses so many jurisdictions and landscapes. It is difficult enough to convince one set of people to agree on a route. Convincing many groups across many states to cooperate over years requires patience, diplomacy, and perhaps at least one person quietly wondering whether a pleasant lake loop might have been a simpler hobby. Still, the work moved forward. By 1937, the Appalachian Trail was declared complete as a continuous footpath from Georgia to Maine. That completion did not mean the route was fixed forever in the form people know today. Far from it. The trail has been rerouted many times over the decades. Road construction, land use changes, erosion, conservation efforts, and the desire to move the trail away from paved sections all altered its course. In some places, what hikers walk now differs substantially from what earlier generations knew. But the symbolic achievement mattered. There was now, in fact, a continuous trail through the Appalachian Mountains, a single route binding together diverse landscapes and communities over an immense distance. It was a remarkable idea, made real through ordinary labour, and there is something very powerful about that combination. The trail's early reputation grew slowly. It was admired within hiking circles before it became widely known in broader culture. For a time, it was less a national legend than a serious undertaking recognised by people already interested in outdoors life. That is often how legends begin, not with instant universal fame, but with a small number of people speaking of something with unusual respect. The Appalachian Trail developed that respect because it was extensive, difficult, and continuous. Continuity matters. Plenty of beautiful trails exist. Plenty of mountains exist. What made the AT special was the possibility of following one footpath for extraordinary distances through changing country without breaking the chain. Then came the idea of the thru-hike, and with it the trail's mythology deepened. A thru-hike, in the modern sense, is the attempt to hike the entire Appalachian Trail in one season. Today, that idea is central to the trail's identity, but it was not always so established. One of the most important figures in this part of the story was Earl Schaffer, who in 1948 became the first person widely recognised as completing a continuous thru-hike of the trail in one journey after World War II. Schaffer famously said he wanted to walk the war out of my system, which is one of those phrases that stays with people because it is so direct. No flourish, no performance, just a plain statement carrying more weight than many longer explanations. That journey mattered because it gave the public a person-sized story through which to understand the trail. It is one thing to hear that a long path exists through mountains and forests. It is another to imagine someone actually walking all of it day after day, carrying their life on their back, moving through weather and terrain for months. A long trail becomes more vivid when attached to a walker. Schaffer's hike helped transform the AT from infrastructure into narrative. It became not just a route, but a test, an odyssey, a thing that could be attempted by a determined individual. That shift was important. People are drawn to stories of endurance because they provide shape to difficulty. They take pain, distance, weather, and uncertainty and make them legible. Over time, more hikers followed. Accounts accumulated. Guidebooks grew more detailed. Trail lore spread. The shelters, viewpoints, hard climbs, easy miles, good water sources, bad weather stories and famous sections all became part of a growing oral and written tradition. The Appalachian Trail was no longer merely a conservation project or a recreational route. It was becoming a culture. And culture, once it forms around a place, does a great deal of work in making that place legendary. Part of that culture comes from the names. On the trail, people often adopt trail names, nicknames given or chosen along the way. Some are funny, some are embarrassing. Some sound unexpectedly noble for people who spent the afternoon trying to dry socks on a branch. Trail names help mark a shift in identity. They allow the ordinary self to loosen a little. At home, a person may be an accountant, teacher, student, retiree, nurse, mechanic, designer or parent dealing with inboxes and appointments. On trail, they become something slightly different. They are still themselves, of course, but reduced and clarified by routine. Walk, filter water, eat, check weather, find shelter, keep going. The AT became legendary, partly because it offered this temporary simplification, this chance to live according to immediate practical needs while carrying a sense of larger purpose. It also helped that the trail crossed so many kinds of landscape without losing its essential identity. Georgia and Maine do not feel the same. The mid-Atlantic does not feel like New England. The southern Appalachians, the farm edges, the deep woods, the balds, the rocky ridges, the foggy climbs, the lower stretches near roads and towns all contribute different moods. A person on the Appalachian Trail is not seeing one repeated scene. They are moving through variation inside continuity, and that combination is deeply satisfying. It offers change without confusion. The white blaze says, "Keep going." The landscape changes around it. That is a structure many people find quietly compelling. By the later 20th century, books and media began to enlarge the legend further. Personal memoirs of thru-hiking introduced the trail to readers who might never set foot on it. Newspaper coverage treated successful hikes as notable achievements. Outdoor magazines, guidebooks, and later documentaries and online communities amplified the trail's status. Then came a major popular boost through works like Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods, which, though humorous and not representative of a full thru hike, brought the Appalachian Trail to a huge general audience. Bryson's version emphasized the contrast between romantic expectation and on-trail reality, which resonated because that contrast is one of the trail's defining truths. People love hearing about big ambitions colliding with roots, rocks, rain, and insufficient preparation. It is relatable. One does not need to be a hiker to understand the feeling of deciding on an impressive life change and then meeting a hill that objects strongly. But media attention alone does not create a legend that lasts. Many places get momentary publicity. The Appalachian Trail endured in the imagination because it connected publicity with lived community. Trail towns played a large role in that. Along the AT, hikers pass through or near small towns that have become part of trail culture. These places offer food, beds, resupply, laundry, advice, weather talk, and the sudden luxury of sitting in a chair that is not made of damp wood or a rolled sleeping pad. Towns became part of the story because they provided relief and human texture. A trail is not only wild land, it is also the rhythm between wild land and brief returns to ordinary comforts. A diner breakfast after several days in the woods can take on the emotional significance of a national holiday. A shower becomes nearly philosophical in its importance. A dry room with a flat floor begins to seem like the result of advanced civilization rather than a normal feature of human housing. This interplay between ruggedness and support helped the trail feel both possible and epic. The AT is hard, but it exists within a corridor of culture. There are volunteers, hostels, maintainers, shuttle drivers, ridge runners, trail angels, local outfitters, and people who simply care about the route because it passes through their region. Trail angels in particular became part of the legend. These are people who offer hikers kindness in various forms: rides, food, water, or small acts of help, often with no expectation of payment. Not every interaction is magical, and one should never romanticize strangers too quickly. But the culture of generosity around the trail contributed enormously to its reputation. A long walk through difficult country becomes more meaningful when punctuated by unexpected human decency. The volunteer system behind the Appalachian Trail also deserves attention because it makes the legend sturdier and more democratic than many realise. Thousands of people help maintain the route. They clear blowdowns, repair erosion, paint blazes, rebuild steps, care for shelters, and perform the unglamorous tasks without which no one would be enjoying scenic overlooks in quite the same mood. There is something deeply American, for better and worse, about a major national treasure depending in part on volunteer labour and determined local organisations. It speaks to civic pride, shared stewardship, and the persuasive power of people who genuinely love a trail enough to dig drainage ditches in unpleasant weather. As the legend grew, so did the symbolism of walking it. For some, the Appalachian Trail became a rite of passage. For others, a reset after grief, burnout, retirement, divorce, military service, illness, or some other major transition. A long trail invites meaning because it offers structure without demanding a single official reason. One person hikes for challenge, another for healing, another because they are 23 and healthy, and have decided that sleeping outdoors for months sounds like an excellent answer to adulthood. The trail accommodates all of these motives, and in doing so it gathers a great many stories. Those stories accumulate around the route like a second landscape, one made of memory rather than rock and route. It is important, though, not to overstate the romance without acknowledging the filter. Legends are curated by survival and retelling. People come back from the trail remembering beauty, hardship, friendships, storms, sunsets, mistakes and lessons. They tell the stories worth keeping. They may laugh later about the days that felt miserable at the time. They may compress weeks of discomfort into a few lines. This is natural. Memory edits for usefulness and coherence. That editing is one reason legendary trails can appear more unified and meaningful from a distance than they feel moment to moment underfoot. On the ground, the AT is often repetitive, uncomfortable, inconvenient, and strange in unremarkable ways. And oddly enough, that helps the legend too. When people achieve something not because every day was transcendent, but because many days were simply hard and they kept going, the story acquires more credibility. The trail also benefited from a certain eastern intimacy. Unlike some enormous western landscapes that overwhelm with scale, the Appalachian Trail often works differently. Much of it moves through enclosed forest. Views are earned rather than constant. The trail can feel close, humid, rooted, and inhabited. It passes through a region dense with history, old communities, layered land use, and long human presence. That gives it a different emotional texture. This is not wilderness imagined as total emptiness. It is a lived-in mountain chain where nature and human history have been entangled for centuries. The trail feels old, not just geologically, but culturally. That oldness feeds the legend. It gives the AT a sense of continuity with earlier walkers, earlier settlements, earlier struggles over land and use and meaning. And then, quietly, the legend began feeding itself. People heard of the trail because it was famous, and walking it became a way of stepping into something already charged with significance. The white blazes came to stand for more than navigation. They represented effort, endurance, simplicity, community, and for some a chance to prove something that could not be proven in everyday office light. There is a reason so many long-distance hikers speak of the trail with affection even when describing appalling weather, aching joints, or a shelter population that included at least one mouse with excellent confidence. Shared hardship builds attachment. It also produces the kind of humour that keeps legends alive. Trails need jokes almost as much as they need water sources. Without jokes, all that remains is dampness and arithmetic. Even the numbers help. More than 2,000 miles is a scale people can grasp and not grasp at the same time. It is large enough to impress immediately, but concrete enough to count. People like knowing where things begin and end. Springer Mountain, Katahdin, northbound, southbound, flip-flop. Section hiker, through hiker, trail magic, 0 day, Nero, shelter, blaze. The vocabulary itself creates belonging. Once a place acquires its own language, it becomes easier for newcomers to imagine joining the world around it. Yet the legend was never built on ease. That is crucial. The Appalachian Trail became beloved not because it promised comfort, but because it combined accessibility of concept with seriousness of execution. Almost anyone can understand the idea of walking from Georgia to Maine. Very few can do it without months of effort, and plenty who start do not finish. That gap between simple idea and difficult reality is where much of the trail's power lies. It is legible enough to dream about and hard enough to respect. By now then, the Appalachian Trail stands not only as a route through mountains, but as a cultural object, a historical project, a volunteer achievement, a storytelling machine, and a test that renews itself with every season's new walkers. It became a legend through planning, labour, memoir, media, community and repetition, but also through the way it resists simplification. The trail keeps correcting people. It welcomes admiration, then hands over steep climbs. It allows a dream, then asks what that dream weighs once packed in a backpack and carried uphill in rain. And that is where the legend becomes especially useful, because once a thing is famous enough, people begin approaching it with assumptions, some helpful, some not. The Appalachian Trail's reputation for beauty and endurance attracts people, but the actual ground beneath that reputation has its own opinions. The woods are not obliged to care that a route is historic. Rocks do not soften for symbolism. Mud does not step aside because a person is having a meaningful life transition, which is why the next part of the story is so important, because legend alone does not explain why certain miles earn dread instead of admiration, and why wilderness, for all its beauty, can be intensely unwelcoming in very practical ways. That is one of the first lessons the trail teaches, and it is usually taught without much ceremony. Wilderness can be beautiful, generous, calming, and deeply restorative. It can also be wet, steep, cold, hot, slippery, badly timed, and completely uninterested in whether you are hoping for personal growth before lunch. People often speak about nature as though it has a moral character, as though the forest is kind, or the mountain is wise, or the trail is welcoming, if only one arrives with the proper attitude. This is understandable. We like stories. We like to imagine that the world has moods arranged around us. But wilderness is not hospitality. It does not wake up in the morning and decide to be cruel either. It simply is what it is, and that can feel wonderful or punishing depending on conditions, preparation and luck. The Appalachian Trail makes this plain faster than many people expect, because it runs through the eastern United States, because it crosses near roads and towns often enough because it is famous and heavily written about. There is sometimes an assumption that it is a safer, softer kind of wildness, manageable wildness, civilized hardship, nothing too dramatic, a long walk with some hills and a healthy amount of granola. And then the trail introduces itself properly. It introduces itself through ankle-turning routes hidden under leaves, through long damp climbs where every rock seems polished by old rain and older bad decisions, through ridges where wind cuts harder than expected, through heat that settles into the trees and refuses to leave, through the strange fact that a place can be green, peaceful, and dangerous all at once. That last part matters because danger on the Appalachian Trail rarely looks theatrical. It is not usually the danger of spectacular cliffs and instant doom, though steep exposure exists in some places. More often it is cumulative. It builds quietly. A little fatigue, a little dehydration, a little delay from bad footing, a change in weather, a missed meal because stopping seemed inconvenient, a wet pair of socks that stays wet too long, a knee beginning to complain on descents, a map that says 4 miles, which sounds pleasant until the terrain reveals that it intends those 4 miles to be educational. This is how wilderness gets its teeth, not always by lunging, but by nibbling at the margins of your energy and judgment until small problems begin holding hands. Beauty is part of the problem, oddly enough. It lowers suspicion. People are more cautious around obviously hostile environments. A desert plainly announces that it may dry you out and leave you regretting every optimistic choice. A snowfield is honest about being cold. A tangled green mountain forest, by contrast, can look almost friendly. Birds sing. Ferns move in the breeze. Sunlight falls nicely through the trees. There may be wildflowers, moss, and a stream making exactly the sort of noise a stressed-out person claims to want in the background of their ideal life. And yet that same forest can hide poor footing, unstable weather, isolation, and distances that feel completely different on the ground than they did in imagination. A beautiful landscape can still hurt you. It can do so while being quite photogenic. There is also the issue of scale, which eastern wilderness handles in a slyer way than some more openly enormous places. The Appalachian range does not always overwhelm with visible vastness. Much of the trail is enclosed by trees. You do not spend every hour gazing across grand open distances and feeling usefully tiny. Often you're in a corridor of woods, seeing just far enough ahead to notice the next obstacle, but not far enough to judge the day clearly. This can create a false sense of nearness. If you are surrounded by vegetation, if roads and towns exist somewhere beyond the ridges, if the trail itself is marked and maintained, then surely help cannot be very far away. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes it still might as well be on the moon. Distance in the woods is not measured only in miles. It is measured in speed, terrain, weather, communication, and the condition of the person trying to move through it. A badly sprained ankle 3 miles from a road can be far more serious than a healthy walk 12 miles from one. A storm can lengthen every task. Wet rock can slow movement to a crawl. Poor cell service can turn a small emergency into a much lonelier one. Even on a famous trail, the basic math of vulnerability remains stubborn. If you're tired, cold, and moving slowly, civilization being technically nearby is not the same as civilization being functionally available. Weather is one of the clearest reasons wilderness becomes unwelcome. The Appalachian Trail crosses a huge range of climates and elevations. Hikers can face humid southern heat, sudden thunderstorms, cold rain, dense fog, early snow, freezing nights, and strong winds, sometimes in combinations that feel frankly rude. One of the great errors inexperienced hikers make is treating temperature as the only weather variable that matters. 50 degrees sounds mild. 50 degrees with rain, wind, soaked clothing, and prolonged exposure can become dangerous very quickly. Heat sounds manageable until humidity turns every climb into a private steam bath. Wind seems refreshing until you step onto an exposed ridge and realize it has stronger opinions than you do. Cold rain deserves special mention because it is so miserable in such an ordinary-looking way. Snow at least gets respect. Snow has drama. Snow announces itself. Cold rain often arrives wearing the disguise of inconvenience, and that is precisely why it can be dangerous. People think they can push through it. Sometimes they can. Sometimes they keep moving just enough to stay warm and everything works out. Sometimes they stop too long, or slow too much, or get too wet, or underestimate how much energy the body spends trying to maintain temperature. The Appalachian Trail has seen its share of hypothermia, not because every hiker is reckless, but because wet cold erodes judgment while pretending to be merely unpleasant. Heat is no kinder. A hot stretch of trail, especially one with long climbs and limited water, can grind a hiker down in ways that are less immediately dramatic, but just as serious. Dehydration sneaks in. Appetite drops. Headaches begin. Electrolytes go missing like unpaid interns. The body becomes less efficient just when the terrain is asking for more from it. Many people imagine that hiking in the woods means shade and therefore comfort. Shade helps, of course, but humidity changes the equation. In the southern and mid-Atlantic sections of the AT, summer heat can settle under the tree cover and linger. Climbing in that kind of air feels like trying to negotiate with a warm, wet blanket that has no interest in compromise. Then there is water itself, which is either too much, too little, or exactly where you do not need it. Wilderness has a remarkable gift for supplying abundance in the wrong format. You may desperately need a dry place to walk and find only mud. You may desperately need a reliable spring and find a trickle that appears to be reconsidering its life choices. The Appalachian Trail includes sections where water sources are plentiful and sections where hikers must plan carefully. Seasonal changes matter. A source listed in a guide may be weak at the wrong time of year. Carrying extra water solves one problem by creating another, because water is heavy, and heavy things become philosophical on climbs. Mud is worth dwelling on for a moment because it sounds trivial until it has eaten enough energy. Mud slows pace, soaks shoes, hides holes, worsens blisters, and turns otherwise simple footing into a negotiation. In some regions, trail culture treats mud almost as a personality type. There are boggy stretches where the ground seems less like earth and more like an ongoing complaint. Step around too much mud and you widen the trail, damaging surrounding vegetation. Step through it, and you begin the days-long conversation with wet feet. Neither option feels elegant. Wilderness often offers choices like that, not good and bad, wet and worse. Footing in general may be the most underrated source of misery on the Appalachian Trail. People think of hiking as walking, which is fair on a grammatical level but misleading in practice. Walking on a paved sidewalk and moving over angled rocks, roots, loose gravel, slick slabs and uneven ledges are very different activities. On difficult trail, the feet and lower legs are doing constant small calculations. Balance shifts, muscles stabilize, attention stays engaged. That continuous demand is tiring even before real obstacles appear. When footing is rough for hours, fatigue becomes cognitive as well as physical. You're not merely tired, you're tired of having to care where every single step lands. There are sections of trail where one inattentive moment is enough to produce a fall, and a fall with a pack on rough ground is rarely graceful. People often ask about wild animals when discussing the Appalachian Trail, and of course animals are part of the environment. Bears, snakes, insects, rodents, and smaller opportunists all play their role, but animals are often less of a problem than the human imagination expects. Black bears generally prefer not to deal with people, though food storage mistakes can teach them unfortunate habits. Snakes want little to do with boots. Mice in shelters, however, have no fear and a remarkable interest in unattended snacks. If the wilderness were run by mice, hikers would lose all their food by dawn, and possibly their dignity by midnight. Still, animal risk on the AT is usually not the main reason certain sections are dreaded. Terrain and exposure do far more consistent damage than wildlife ever manages. What does catch people off guard is how quickly wilderness punishes poor judgment. Not bad character, not moral weakness, just poor judgment. Starting too late in the day, skipping forecast checks, underestimating mileage in hard terrain, overestimating one's fitness because of gym workouts conducted on machines that remain level and obedient. Packing too much, packing too little, assuming that because a section is famous, it is automatically forgiving. None of these decisions sounds catastrophic on its own. Put them together in rough country and the trail begins collecting payment. Another difficulty is that the Appalachian Trail can seem socially protective while still being individually isolating. During peak season there may be plenty of hikers around, especially in the southern stretches. Shelters fill, campsites gather little temporary communities. People share weather rumours, snack opinions and medical updates concerning their feet with a frankness usually reserved for wartime. This sociability can be comforting. It can also create false confidence. Seeing others on the trail does not remove risk. It merely changes its shape. You can still get separated. You can still make choices based on someone else's pace rather than your own condition. You can still feel intensely alone in the middle of a crowd if you are struggling, and everyone else seems to be handling it better. The mental side of wilderness discomfort is often harder to explain to people who have not spent long days outside under strain. There is a specific kind of weariness that comes from continuous decision-making in imperfect conditions. When to stop, whether to push on, how much water remains, whether that cloud bank is becoming a storm, whether the descent will be harder on the knees than the climb was on the lungs, whether the body is merely complaining in the normal way or beginning to fail in a more serious one. Long hikes are full of these judgments, and judgment degrades with fatigue. That is one reason experienced hikers respect difficult sections so much. They know the body is not the only thing being tested. The mind grows sloppy too. And then there is fear, which does not always arrive wearing a dramatic face. Sometimes fear is just a slight tightening in the chest when fog closes in and visibility drops. Sometimes it is the uncomfortable realization that darkness is coming faster than expected. Sometimes it's hearing thunder when you're still on high ground. Sometimes it's the slow recognition that the route you thought would be merely challenging is becoming exhausting, and you do not have much extra left. Fear in the woods is often practical. It says, this could get worse. The problem is that practical fear can either sharpen attention or push a person into rushed mistakes. Much depends on temperament, experience, and how many calories are currently available to the brain. The Appalachian Trail also exposes a basic truth people do not always like to admit. Wilderness does not care about fairness. It does not care whether you trained hard, whether you have noble intentions, or whether you really needed this trip to be meaningful. It does not distribute hardship evenly. One hiker gets clear skies. Another same route next day gets sleet and sideways wind. One person glides over wet roots like a woodland deer with excellent insurance. Another slips twice before breakfast and spends the day muttering at botany. Sometimes preparation pays off beautifully. Sometimes it merely prevents a difficult day from becoming a dangerous one. That is not failure. That is often the best possible outcome. It is also worth remembering that the trail changes what counts as welcoming. In daily life, we use that word easily. A place is welcoming if it is comfortable, navigable, and arranged in a way that does not require too much from us. Wilderness is different. It may offer rewards, but they are not the same as welcome. It offers views, silence, challenge, wildlife, distance from noise, and the satisfaction of moving under one's own power through difficult land. What it does not offer is any guarantee that you will feel held, safe, dry, rested, or emotionally balanced while doing so. Sometimes a forest gives peace, sometimes it gives a blister, a storm, and a lesson in humility. Often it gives both. This is why experienced hikers develop such a sober respect for sections others romanticize. They understand that a trail can be scenic and still punish error. They know that shelters are not magical sanctuaries, only crude structures that improve one problem while introducing several others. They know that a clean overlook in good weather can turn menacing under cloud and wind. They know that green tunnels can become morale traps when views disappear and climbs keep coming. They know that even moderate terrain becomes serious when stacked onto weeks of fatigue. Wilderness is not always unwelcoming in some grand absolute sense. It becomes unwelcoming when conditions and human limits begin to misalign. And of course, human beings are wonderfully talented at helping that misalignment along. We bring assumptions, we bring optimism, we bring gear bought in excitement and plans made at kitchen tables. We bring a touching belief that this time, unlike every other time, we will certainly not pack too many snacks of the wrong kind. Then the trail edits us. It strips away excess confidence. It reveals where preparation was real and where it was mostly aesthetic. This is not a cruel process exactly, but it can feel rude. A mountain has a way of making nonsense of self-image. The person who imagined themselves boldly striding into the wild may discover that they are, in fact, a perfectly decent adult who would really prefer a level surface and a sandwich not compressed into a backpack corner. None of this means wilderness is hostile in a moral sense. It means it is indifferent, and indifference can be harsh when people expect affirmation. The Appalachian Trail has endured in part because it offers that indifference in manageable doses for those prepared to meet it. It does not flatter. It does not organize itself around comfort. It offers a route, not a promise. That is part of why people return to it, and part of why they speak with such precision about the stretches that demand more than others. Once you stop expecting welcome, you begin to notice the real currencies of the trail instead. Water, daylight, dry socks, good footing, stable weather, reliable companions, a body still functioning well enough to keep moving. And when those currencies become scarce, certain sections of the AT reveal themselves very clearly. They stop being abstract names in guidebooks and become places where all these pressures come together at once. Long climbs, hard descents, exposure, rock, weather, fatigue. Some stretches are famous because they combine several forms of hardship into one memorable package. They are not always the highest or most remote. Sometimes they are simply relentless. Sometimes they are difficult because the consequences of error rise quickly. Sometimes they are difficult because progress slows so dramatically that hikers lose time, energy, and morale faster than planned. Among all those dreaded names, a few stand out immediately, and if one section has earned an especially firm place in trail lore as a place where beauty and punishment walk side by side, it is the high, rugged country farther north, where the mountains grow steeper, the weather less patient, and every mile begins to feel as though it was designed by someone with a personal disagreement against knees. If the Appalachian Trail spends much of its length teaching patience, the White Mountains teach honesty. They are the section where a great many hikers stop speaking in broad, cheerful terms about the trail and begin speaking very specifically about knees, weather, exposure, and the exact speed at which morale can drain from a person who thought 10 miles sounded modest on paper. In New Hampshire, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy warns that the mountains are very steep and rugged, that hikers need to be in seriously good shape with strong knees, and that above tree-line travel in bad weather adds real danger. The ATC also describes New Hampshire and southern Maine as generally the most difficult part of the entire trail, with steep ascents and descents, long distances between road crossings in places, and rocky root-filled tread. It even notes that daily mileage can drop by as much as 30% in this terrain. That is not guidebook drama. That is the official trail voice saying, politely but clearly, this part is different. That difference begins with a basic misunderstanding many people bring to eastern mountains. They assume older mountains must be gentler mountains. This is a very human mistake. Age sounds softening. Age sounds like rounding, weathering, mellowing, the landscape equivalent of settling into a sensible cardigan. The White Mountains reject that assumption almost immediately. They are not towering in the Western sense, but they make up for that by being steep, broken, rough underfoot, and often arranged in a way that feels personally sceptical of your timetable. On many parts of the Appalachian Trail, hikers can fall into a rhythm. In the Whites, rhythm is interrupted constantly by climbs that bite, descents that punish, and surfaces that refuse to let the feet relax for very long. The trail is still the trail, the white blazes are still there, but the margin for casual strolling narrows sharply. One reason every mile feels earned here is that so much of the difficulty stacks all at once. It is not just elevation gain, it is not just rock, it is not just weather. It is the way each problem arrives holding hands with the others. The ATC points out that certain sections of the trail, especially above tree line, are harder to follow than others, and that in New Hampshire and Maine, blazing may give way to cairns. After storms or in snow, the trail may be hard or even impossible to find. The White Mountain National Forest adds the same caution in plainer public safety language, warning that severe weather or a wrong turn can become life-threatening, and that the weather in the White Mountains is unpredictable even when the day looks gorgeous at lower elevations. That is what makes the Whites so memorable. They are not merely strenuous. They are strenuous in ways that leave little room for sloppy assumptions. Then there is the above tree-line travel, which changes the character of the Appalachian Trail more than almost anything else in the East. Much of the AT elsewhere moves through what hikers call the Green Tunnel, long corridors of forest where views come and go and the trees provide at least some shelter from wind and weather. In the White Mountains, that protection repeatedly falls away. The ATC notes that on Franconia Ridge the trail spends just over 2 miles continuously above tree line, one of the longest such stretches on the entire route, and that hikers pass through one of the few Arctic alpine zones in New England, an environment so rare and fragile that special planning is underway to protect it. That sounds lovely, and it is lovely, but it is also exposure in the most literal sense. When the trees vanish, so do many of your buffers. Wind reaches you properly, clouds reach you properly. The sky stops being decoration and becomes part of the terrain. This is where the White Mountains begin to feel less like a trail section and more like a long negotiation with conditions. A forest can be unpleasant, but it can also hide you. Above tree line, there is no hiding. You're simply there, moving over open rock, hoping the weather remains a cooperative professional rather than an erratic manager changing the entire shift schedule without warning. The ATC notes that the Presidential Range has seen snow in every month of the year. The White Mountain National Forest separately warns hikers to bring warm clothing and good rain gear even when it is sunny and warm where they start, because the mountains may be cold anyway. This is one of those details hikers remember very clearly. The valley says one thing, the ridge says another. The body unfortunately has to answer to the ridge. A person can understand that intellectually and still be surprised by it physically. That is another White Mountain specialty. You know you're climbing into rough country. You know you packed layers. You know the forecast mentioned wind, perhaps in that optimistic weather service tone. that can make serious conditions sound like a brisk inconvenience. But knowledge and experience are not identical. The White Mountains are full of places where understanding the danger in theory does not prepare you for the exact way a gust grabs at your pack on exposed rock, or how quickly a warm climb can turn into a chilling stop once sweat, wind, and cloud all join the meeting. This is why the Forest Service's advice sounds so basic and so stern at the same time. Check the forecast, bring warm layers, bring rain gear, consider postponing. The mountains will be there another day. That is not poetic humility. It is practical survival advice from people who know this range well. The ground itself is no gentler than the weather. One of the reasons hikers say every mile here feels earned is that progress is slower than outsiders expect, sometimes dramatically slower. On easier trail, mileage can be reassuring. You make steady forward progress. You look at the map, estimate your pace, and things mostly behave. In the whites, mileage becomes slippery. 10 miles can feel like a full day's labour because the trail demands constant attention. The ATC notes that the treadway in hard sections can be rocky, rooty, or muddy, and that in the extremely rugged terrain of New Hampshire, daily mileage commonly drops. That reduction is not because everyone suddenly becomes lazy upon crossing a state line. It is because the route requires more effort per step. You're climbing, balancing, descending, pausing, adjusting, scrambling a little, thinking more carefully, and occasionally wondering whether your map is mocking you. And yes, scrambling matters here in a way many first-time hikers do not expect. One official Appalachian Trail publication describing in-to-in travel in the White Mountains says plainly that many places are steep enough to require the use of hands. It also says the area is not recommended for hikers who fear heights, lack agility, or are not already in good physical condition. That is an unusually candid description for a region also being sold, quite reasonably, on its spectacular views. It tells you something important about the White Mountain section of the AT. This is not difficult only in the sense of a bit tiring. It is difficult in the sense that the body must sometimes climb rather than merely walk, and must do so while carrying weight, managing weather, and staying composed. A long trail begins feeling very different when the word hiking occasionally shades into careful use of hands. The presidential range deserves its reputation in this regard. Even people who have never set foot there often know the name, usually because someone else has said it with a particular look. It is one of those mountain areas where grandeur and trouble live very close together. The AMC's own material for the presidential traverse sends hikers to weather and trail conditions resources as a central planning step, which tells you a great deal before a boot has touched stone. The ATC's New Hampshire guidance ties the range directly to above tree-line danger, and the AMC's hut descriptions remind visitors that places like Madison Spring Hut sit right in that high exposed country between major peaks. In other words, this is not a small scenic detour. It is major mountain terrain where the trail passes directly through conditions that demand competence, timing, and a healthy dislike of avoidable mistakes. All of that would be enough to make the White Mountains hard, but there is another layer, and it is the one many long-distance hikers feel most strongly. By the time northbound hikers arrive here, they have already walked a very long way. Their trail legs may be strong, but strength is not the same as freshness. They arrive carrying accumulated fatigue, little injuries, changed appetites, worn gear, and often a degree of emotional wear that does not show up in photographs. Then the whites ask them to slow down just when they have spent weeks or months learning how to move efficiently. The ATC specifically notes that northbound hikers who have built bigger mileage elsewhere should expect it to drop here. That can be frustrating in a very particular way. It is one thing to know a section is hard. It is another to feel your pace collapse on ground that seems determined to charge full price for every single mile. It also changes the social rhythm of the trail. On gentler sections, hikers spread and regroup with relative ease. In the whites, plans tighten, weather windows matter more, shelter and campsite options matter more, exit points matter more. The ATC notes that this is one of the most visited places on the East Coast, and that special rules and fees apply to protect the area and offset management costs. In the same general region, some overnight sites require fees, and the most attractive overnight options in the White Mountains are AMC's full-service huts, which can cost more than $100 a night for meals and lodging, though a limited number of thru-hikers may get work-for-stay opportunities. That creates a very different kind of trail calculus. In many other places, a tired hiker can simply aim for a shelter or a bit of legal ground. Here, terrain, regulation and cost can all enter the conversation together. The huts themselves are part of what makes the White Mountains so unusual on the Appalachian Trail. AMC describes a system of 8 full-service huts in the White Mountain National Forest, and the trail publication on hut-to-hut travel explains that they allow hikers to cross this area carrying much less than a full backpack, provided they have reservations and proper planning. For day hikers or well-organised traverses, that can make the whites more accessible. For thru-hikers, though, the huts can be both blessing and reminder. They offer structure in country where structure is very welcome, but they also underline how serious the terrain is. If a place develops a whole support system of alpine-style huts, weather resources, passes, rules, and work-for-stay arrangements, it is usually because strolling through with a carefree shrug proved less than ideal. What hikers often remember most, though, is not one single hazard, but the relentlessness. The whites are full of moments where a person earns a ridge, enjoys it for perhaps 6.5 minutes, then discovers that what follows is not rest, but another technical descent, another rocky traverse, another climb, another weather check, another careful look at the time. The range has a way of denying easy victory laps. The reward is there, certainly. Franconia Ridge is beautiful, the Presidential Range is beautiful, the Alpine Zone is rare and striking, the views can be extraordinary. But the mountains are never really saying, "Here, you have worked hard, let us now make things simple." They are saying, "Yes, that was lovely. Now place your feet carefully and keep going." That is why hikers speak of this section with such respect, not only because it is scenic, and not only because it is hard, but because the scenery and the hardness are inseparable. The White Mountains do not alternate beauty and difficulty in tidy sequence. They blend them. You can be dazzled and tired at the same time. You can feel lucky to be there, and also deeply annoyed with the next descent. You can look out over one of the most impressive stretches on the whole Appalachian Trail, while privately bargaining with your knees like a diplomat handling a difficult treaty. This blend creates a very specific emotional texture. It is not the easy affection of a gentle wooded path. It is the respect reserved for a place that gives a lot and asks a lot back. It also explains why some hikers avoid the White Mountains in certain conditions, or approach them with more planning than they gave entire previous states. That avoidance is not a rejection of beauty. It is recognition that beauty without margin can become a trap. Above treeline route finding may be harder. Cairns can replace blazes. Weather can shift faster than comfort. Snow has fallen in every month in the Presidential Range. Severe weather or one wrong turn can become life-threatening. These are not rumours traded around hostel porches for dramatic effect. They are the official cautions attached to this section by the very organisations responsible for helping people travel through it safely. Respect here is not optional polish. It is part of the equipment. And yet hikers still come, year after year, because the White Mountains do something the rest of the trail only hints at. They compress the whole bargain of the Appalachian Trail into a smaller space. You get the grandeur, the fatigue, the weather, the route finding, the community infrastructure, the need for judgment, the satisfaction of making it through, and the immediate understanding that not all miles are created equal. In the Whites, the trail stops pretending to be a long walk and becomes unmistakably mountain travel. That is why people remember it so clearly, why they warn each other about it, why they admire it, and why some decide that admiration from a safer distance is perfectly acceptable. A mountain section does not have to be universally avoided to become legendary. It merely has to make enough people say, with complete sincerity, that those were some of the hardest miles of the entire trip. And once a hiker has been taught by the Whites that short distances can take a very long time indeed, the trail has one more lesson waiting just ahead, in a place farther northeast where mileage slows from difficult to almost absurd, and where forward movement starts to feel less like hiking and more like solving a stubborn physical puzzle, one careful body length at a time. And after the White Mountains have already taught a hiker that 1 mile in rough country is not the same thing as 1 mile anywhere else, the trail offers a section that pushes that lesson to an almost absurd conclusion. Mahoosuc Notch, on the New Hampshire-Maine border region, is one of the most famous short stretches on the entire Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy calls it the hardest mile on the trail, a mile-long, boulder-filled canyon that feels more like scrambling than hiking, while AMC describes it as the AT's longest mile, and notes that the broader Mahoosuc Trail predates the Appalachian Trail itself. That is already a clue that something unusual is going on here. This is not merely a rough patch of ordinary footpath. It is a place with its own identity, its own reputation, and its own ability to make very fit people move at the speed of a thoughtful household appliance. What makes the Notch so strange is that it does not behave like a trail in the usual sense. On most difficult sections of the Appalachian Trail, the hardship still falls within the basic category of walking uphill, walking downhill, picking your steps carefully, and accepting that your legs have joined a union against you. Mahoosuc Notch changes the job description. AMC's description is unusually blunt about it. You crane your neck upward, study the incline, and crawl on your hands and knees to make progress. The ATC's main guide says much the same thing in fewer words when it notes that the route is often likened more to scrambling than hiking. That distinction matters. Scrambling is slower, more physical, more deliberate, and much harder to do absent-mindedly. A hiker cannot just settle into stride here. Every few feet ask a new question, over, under, around, through, or perhaps stop and reconsider everything while balanced next to a boulder the size of a large appliance. The reason for that weirdness is geological as much as it is recreational. Maine's own planning documents describe Mahoosuc Notch as a striking jumble of car-sized boulders wedged between two sheer 400-foot cliffs. The state identifies it as a rare, cold-air talus slope community, formed where lack of sunlight, drainage of cold air, and a heavy accumulation of boulders create a very unusual microclimate. MC explains the broader shape of the terrain in more accessible hiking language, noting that the rugged character of the area comes from cliff faces carved by glacial activity and the talus slopes that formed as exposed rock weathered and crumbled into boulder fields. In plain terms, the Notch feels like a giant stone spill because, over a very long time, that is essentially what it became. The trail does not pass neatly along the edge of this broken terrain. It goes right through it. That is one reason the Notch often becomes the slowest mile people hike on the entire Appalachian Trail. Normal trail mileage depends on rhythm. You plant the feet, breathe, settle in, and convert time into distance. Mahoosuc Notch breaks rhythm constantly. You stop to choose a route. You test a foothold. You lower yourself into a gap between rocks. You pull upward with your arms as much as your legs. You make a few yards of progress and then find that the next obstacle has its own ideas about how a human body carrying a backpack ought to pass through. ATC's main page calls it a mile-long, boulder-filled canyon that challenges even very strong hikers. An ATC Journeys account describes it as an obstacle course of enormous boulders and one of the hardest and slowest stretches on the entire trail. AMC's own Notch story says the hikers featured there took an hour and a half to get through the mile, and that was not because they had become lazy or distracted by scenery. It was because the terrain simply demanded that pace. It is also strange in a sensory way that hikers remember very clearly. The Notch is dark compared with surrounding ridges, cooler than you expect, and oddly cave-like in places. Maine's management material explains why. Because the boulders block sunlight and cold air drains and stays trapped in the Notch, ice chunks can linger well into the summer. AMC says backpackers have found ice and snow there in the height of summer, with streams running beneath the boulders creating natural air conditioning. That means the Notch can feel out of season even on a warm day. There is something disorienting about sweating through mountain terrain and then entering a broken stone corridor where summer seems to have been misplaced under the rocks. It is not supernatural. It is not mystical. It is simply a very odd piece of mountain topography doing exactly what physics tells it to do, and yet to a tired hiker, it can feel like the trail has briefly changed species. That cold, shaded atmosphere adds to the section's reputation because it changes how people move and how they feel while moving. A rocky climb in daylight on open ledges is tiring in one way. A boulder maze in dim, cool air is tiring in another. The body works hard, but the mind works just as hard. There is no easy flow to it. AMC's account captures this well when it describes hikers hearing others before seeing them, as voices echo through the stone passages and encountering narrow cave-like gaps between rocks. Hikers lose their sense of distance. They think they must be halfway, then discover they have thought that several times already. That mental distortion is part of why Mahoosuc Notch becomes legendary. It does not merely slow your pace, it interferes with your sense of what a mile even means. A mile on a map looks small and tidy. A mile inside a boulder puzzle feels much less interested in neat measurement. It is worth saying, too, that the Notch's reputation is not based only on technical difficulty. It also depends on where it sits in the broader hiking day. Very few people arrive there fresh, cheerful, and carrying no fatigue from surrounding terrain. AMC's Mahoosuc article makes this painfully clear. The descent into the Notch from Mahoosuc Arm left the hikers already fatigued, with burning quadriceps, before the real obstacle course even began. After the Notch, the climb onward toward Full Goose was still steep enough to make them grateful they had stopped short the previous evening. This is how notorious trail sections build their power. They do not appear in isolation, like a gym challenge neatly inserted into an otherwise reasonable afternoon. They arrive after work has already been done, and before more work is finished. Mahoosuc Notch is hard partly because the body entering it has usually paid an entry fee in sweat and impact already. That is also why even experienced hikers sometimes avoid it, postpone it, or approach it very differently from the rest of the trail. The Notch punishes haste. It punishes bad timing. It punishes the assumption that a short section can be tacked onto the end of a day just because the mileage looks modest. AMC notes that the unsteady footing makes night hiking dangerous there even with headlamps, which is exactly the kind of sentence that sounds obvious only after you imagine trying to navigate refrigerator-sized boulders in the dark while tired. A normal late-day push on ordinary trail is one thing. A late-day push in Mahoosuc Notch is a much more serious choice, and because the section's difficulty is so physical and irregular, larger packs, fatigue, wet conditions, and reduced concentration all matter more than usual. The Notch is not a place that rewards anyone for trying to save 30 minutes through optimism. Then there is the matter of personality, because places on the Appalachian Trail do seem to acquire personalities whether or not geology asks for that burden. What is interesting about Mahoosuc Notch is that hikers do not speak about it in one single emotional register. A TC presents it as a serious challenge. Maine's management documents describe it in ecological and physical terms that sound almost clinical until you picture yourself scrambling through them. AMC calls the section stubborn but forgiving, ambitious yet unassuming. That feels accurate to the trail culture around it. Some hikers dread the Notch for months, others end up loving it, at least once it is behind them and they are no longer wedged between rocks wondering how a backpack became wider than common sense. It is difficult in a way that can become oddly memorable, even fun, for people who like puzzles, movement and terrain that demands full attention. But fun here is a specialised word. It means enjoyable to those who appreciate controlled struggle, not pleasant in the ordinary sense of the word that might also apply to a good meal or a comfortable chair. Its fame is helped along by the fact that it is so physically specific. Many hard trail sections are hard in broad, familiar ways. They are steep, long, hot, exposed or rocky. Mahoosuc Notch is memorable because almost nobody confuses it with anywhere else. It has car-sized boulders, narrow passages, summer ice, trapped cold air, and a route that shifts the hiker from walking to climbing and squeezing. The USDA Forest Service has even referred to it as the most rugged mile of the Appalachian Trail in describing the recreation value of the broader Grafton Notch area. When an official land management source uses the word rugged that directly, it suggests the reputation has long since escaped the realm of campfire exaggeration. Mahoosuc Notch is not just hard by rumour, it is hard by design. If by design we mean the very old and not especially considerate design choices of glaciers, gravity, and time. There is also a practical lesson buried in the Notch's reputation, and it is one the Appalachian Trail repeats often in different forms. Short does not mean easy. Low mileage does not mean quick. A map can tell you the distance, but it cannot fully express the shape of the effort inside that distance. That lesson matters on the AT because hikers constantly plan around mileage. They estimate camp, they estimate water, they estimate food, they estimate daylight. Most of the time, those estimates are useful. Then a place like Mahoosuc Notch arrives and reminds everyone that terrain can veto arithmetic. An hour and a half for 1 mile is not absurd in the Notch. It is simply what the ground may require. That is why strong hikers respect it. It exposes how badly the body wants a simple system and how readily the mountains answer with a stone maze instead. And still, for all the dread it inspires, the Notch has one more trick. It earns affection precisely because it is so unlike the rest of the trail. People remember the suffering, certainly. They remember the snagged pack, the awkward body angles, the slow progress, the cold air rising from beneath the rocks, and the suspicion that the half-mile marker, if such a thing existed, would be a known liar. But they also remember that the Notch demanded presence. There is no room there for half-hearted hiking. You're fully occupied, fully engaged, entirely prevented from thinking too far ahead, because the next 10 feet are busy enough. In that sense, the section becomes almost a rough form of clarity. It narrows the world to movement, decision, balance, and patience. It is deeply inconvenient clarity, of course, and few would request it in daily life. But the trail has always been in the business of teaching people things they did not quite mean to sign up for. So when hikers say Mahoosuc Notch is the slowest and strangest stretch on the Appalachian Trail, they are not just repeating a colourful bit of trail gossip. They are describing a place where ordinary mileage breaks down, where geology turns walking into problem solving, where summer can contain hidden ice, and where even skilled hikers are reduced to patient, awkward, deliberate motion through a corridor of stone. It is a section people boast about, complain about, avoid in poor timing, and remember in exact physical detail years later. That is usually the sign of a real trail legend. Not simply that it is hard, but that it changes the language people use for distance, effort, and what counts as progress. And once a hiker crawls out of that boulder maze and believes the day's weirdness must surely have peaked, the Appalachian Trail in this part of the world has a habit of answering not quite, because beyond the famous obstacle there are still whole stretches where the trouble is less dramatic to describe and in some ways even harder to endure, especially when the sun climbs high. The water runs uncertain, and the trail begins taking as much out of the mind as it does out of the legs. If the White Mountains and Mahoosuc Notch make hikers feel as though the trail has turned into a mountain exam written in rock and weather, Pennsylvania does something more repetitive and in some ways more maddening. It wears people down. Not always with spectacular danger, not always with postcard drama. Very often it does it with the kind of steady, grinding discomfort that turns every footfall into a minor complaint and every ridge into a test of patience. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy says Pennsylvania's nickname on the trail is Rock Sylvania, and adds that the state is especially famous for rocky terrain on the long, flat ridges north of the Susquehanna River, even while the southern part of the state includes some of the gentlest, smoothest trail on the entire Appalachian Trail, including the Cumberland Valley. Pennsylvania also holds about 230 miles of the route and 27 shelters, so hikers do not pass through it in a quick afternoon. They live with it for a while, and that is exactly why its reputation stays with them. That contrast is one of the reasons Pennsylvania is so memorable. It is not a state of one mood. It begins, for many northbound hikers, with a certain false reassurance. Southern Pennsylvania can feel refreshingly manageable after some of the harsher terrain that comes before it. The ATC explicitly says that part of the state offers some of the smoothest and gentlest terrain on the whole trail, and the Cumberland Valley is often singled out as one of the easier walking stretches. The trail even passes through the lowlands there rather than clinging to mountain ridges the whole time. This matters because it creates expectation, and expectation is one of the trail's favourite things to punish. When hikers first enjoy those easier miles, they may begin to think Pennsylvania's bad reputation is a bit exaggerated, perhaps the sort of overblown tradition hikers repeat because everyone likes a dramatic nickname. Then they keep walking north, and Pennsylvania introduces the rest of itself. The real trouble is not just that Pennsylvania has rocks. Most places on the Appalachian Trail have rocks. The trouble is the type, the quantity, and the persistence. These are often not the large, obvious boulders that force you into slow, deliberate climbing, and at least have the decency to announce themselves. Pennsylvania is notorious for smaller, sharper, ankle-turning, soul-bruising rocks scattered along long ridges, the sort that keep the feet from ever finding a comfortable rhythm. DCNR, Pennsylvania's own trail guide, describes the state's AT difficulty as ranging from semi-flat and clear paths to notorious hilly and rocky sections. The ATC is more specific about where the reputation comes from, pointing to the long flat ridges north of the Susquehanna River. That combination is what makes the state so psychologically effective. Flat sounds easy, long sounds efficient. Put sharp broken stone under both and suddenly the trail is asking the feet to do careful labour for mile after mile, without the dignity of a proper mountain view to justify the argument. There is something uniquely irritating about terrain that is not dramatic enough to be admired for its hardship, yet not gentle enough to be enjoyed. Pennsylvania often lives in that exact middle ground. A steep mountain at least feels like an event. You climb, you sweat, you crest, you understand the bargain. A long rocky ridge can feel like paperwork. It just keeps going, not in a heroic straight-up way, but in a needling repetitive way that asks your feet to absorb insult after insult, while the rest of you tries to remain philosophical. And philosophy, it turns out, becomes much harder once the bottoms of your feet begin sending formal letters of protest. Hikers talk about Pennsylvania bruising the feet because it really can. The rocks here have a talent for striking through shoe cushioning, especially after hundreds of miles have already worn both body and footwear down. Trail shoes that felt lively 2 states ago begin to feel suspiciously decorative. That is why Pennsylvania so often bruises patients as much as feet. The physical discomfort is constant, but the emotional effect may be worse. Pain that comes in one dramatic burst can be met with adrenaline and determination. Pain that comes in a steady low-grade stream is another matter. It creates irritability. It makes small delays feel personal. It turns the act of stepping into an ongoing negotiation with the ground. You begin trying to place each foot carefully, not because the trail is technically complex in the way Mahoosuc Notch is complex, but because every careless step lands on another pointed stone, with all the tenderness of a tax audit. The pace may still look reasonable on paper, the mileage may still move, but inside the hiker's body morale is being charged by the hour. And then there is the way Pennsylvania distributes this suffering over enough time to become a genuine chapter in trail memory. At roughly 230 miles, it is not a state you simply dash through unless you're exceptionally strong, badly organised, or being chased by a very unusual deadline. The ATC's state page makes that number plain, and the length matters because discomfort repeated over days becomes identity. A single hard ridge is a story. 230 miles of mixed terrain, some easy, some maddening, become a season of opinion. By the time hikers leave Pennsylvania, they usually have a settled view on it, and that view often contains a level of detail reserved for things that hurt repeatedly. They remember exactly which kind of rocks they mean. They remember which descents made them reconsider their life choices. They remember that a state can be beautiful and infuriating without contradiction. Of course, Pennsylvania is not only rock. That is part of what makes its reputation slightly unfair and completely understandable at the same time. The state includes lovely stretches, ridgeline views, historic trail culture, and one of the most symbolically important places on the whole Appalachian Trail, Pine Grove Furnace State Park, home to the Appalachian Trail Museum, and long associated with the trail's midpoint in the popular imagination. The museum itself describes its location as very close to the midpoint, and ATC has a hike listing for the well-known 2011 midpoint sign near Pine Grove Furnace. That area carries a different emotional charge for many long-distance hikers. It feels like progress made visible. You have walked far enough that the trail begins offering ceremonial moments, places where people take photographs, eat too much food, and briefly imagine that the second half will be exactly as manageable as the first, if only they maintain a positive attitude and perhaps buy better snacks. That midpoint energy is one reason Pennsylvania can be deceptive. It contains morale boosts in the middle of its punishment. Pine Grove Furnace is famous in trail lore not simply because of the museum and the midpoint idea, but because it is one of those rare places where the trail's culture becomes almost concentrated. History, tradition, hikers passing through, small rituals of progress, all of it gathers there. For a little while, the state feels generous. It offers context. It reminds people they are part of something older and larger than their current sore feet. Then the ridges resume, the stones return, and the trail asks whether symbolism has improved anyone's foot pain in measurable ways. Usually it has not. Meaning is lovely. Cushioning is better. The state also has a curious talent for mixing ordinary trail hardship with less obvious historical and environmental layers. Near Palmerton, for example, the ATC notes that the trail once skirted land damaged by decades of zinc smelting pollution, and that after a long EPA Superfund restoration effort, the route was relocated so hikers could pass through the recovering area itself. That means Pennsylvania's difficulty is not only geological. In places, the trail also passes through landscapes marked by industrial history and ecological repair. A hiker may not experience that as immediate suffering in the same way they experience a bruised heel, but it adds texture to the state's identity. Pennsylvania on the Appalachian Trail is not simply a natural obstacle course. It is also a corridor through old ridges, old industry, old communities, and the long aftermath of human use. That gives the state a roughness beyond the stones. Still, most hikers speak first about the rocks, because the rocks are democratic. They affect nearly everyone. The fit hiker, the tired hiker, the cheerful one, the grim one, the person with expensive footwear, and the person who has been pretending their shoes are still fine because denial weighs less than a new pair. Pennsylvania's rockiness is also sneaky, in that it often shows up on stretches that are otherwise not especially slow in a navigational sense. The trail is there, the blazes are there, the path is obvious enough. You're not route finding through fog or crawling through a boulder maze. You're just repeatedly stepping on awkward, uneven, pointed terrain for hour after hour. That sort of hardship lacks glamour, which is why it gets underestimated by outsiders and remembered so vividly by those who have done it. It also changes the body in very specific ways. Long rocky walking can produce bruised soles, sore ankles, inflamed knees from uneven footing, and a general muscular fatigue that comes from never quite landing cleanly. Smooth ground allows the stride to repeat. Rocky ground forces constant adjustment. Every step is a tiny correction. Those tiny corrections add up. A hiker may finish the day not feeling spectacularly injured, yet somehow more drained than expected, as though the trail had spent 8 hours stealing energy in coin-sized pieces. This is one reason Pennsylvania can be harder on patients than steeper places. The body does not always get the emotional reward of a summit effort. It simply accumulates a long account of irritation. Some parts of the state also carry the more ordinary risks of Eastern Ridge hiking. DCNR's trail page for the pinnacle on Blue Mountain warns hikers that spring through early fall brings copperheads and rattlesnakes to that rocky mountain environment, and advises people to watch where they step. That caution is for a popular hike on Blue Mountain, but it captures something broader about Pennsylvania's ridgeline country. When the ground is already asking you to place your feet carefully, the possibility of snakes does not improve the mood. This is not usually the central reason hikers dread Pennsylvania, and most will pass through without any serious wildlife issue at all, but it contributes to the state's atmosphere. The rocks demand attention, the heat can be tiring, the ridges can feel repetitive, and just to encourage mindfulness, the local advice includes being careful where your hands and feet go. What makes the state especially hard for long-distance hikers is where it often lands in the broader journey. Northbound hikers reach Pennsylvania after already covering an enormous amount of trail. They may be stronger than when they started, but they are not fresh. Shoes are worn, bodies carry small hurts. The novelty that sweetened early difficulties has faded. By then, hikers know what a hard day feels like, which means they can also recognise the particular tedium of a state that keeps delivering pain without much variation in the method. It is one thing to be challenged by alpine weather or a famous mountain scramble. It is another to spend days muttering at the ground because it cannot seem to stop being pointy. One form of hardship feels epic, the other feels administrative, and yet Pennsylvania is not without charm. That is important, because states rarely become trail legends by being one note. The ATC points out that the state is not all rocks, and that matters. There are good views, there are easier stretches. There are trail towns such as Boiling Springs, Duncannon, Delaware Water Gap and others recognised through the AT Community Programme. There is the peculiar relief of the Cumberland Valley. There is Pine Grove Furnace and the museum. There are shelters and maintainers and the ordinary kindnesses of trail culture. If Pennsylvania were uniformly miserable, it would be easier to dismiss. Instead, it alternates. It gives a lovely stretch, then another ridge of rock. It gives a historical landmark, then a day of sore-footed plodding. It gives enough beauty to keep people from hating it completely, and enough irritation to keep them talking about it for years. That alternating quality may be the real reason the state bruises patience. Patience suffers most when discomfort is mixed with hope. If a place is obviously dreadful, you brace yourself. If a place keeps suggesting relief might be just ahead, you remain emotionally invested in the possibility of an easier tomorrow. Pennsylvania knows how to offer that possibility. The southern smoothness is real. The valley walking is real. The towns and social moments are real. But so is the long, stony work north of the Susquehanna. And because the trail never quite settles into one stable mood, the hiker keeps adjusting expectations, which is tiring in its own subtle way. You're not merely walking. You're repeatedly renegotiating your opinion of an entire state. There is something almost comic about how often hikers leave Pennsylvania with a grudging respect for what it has done to them. They may complain loudly while they are in it. They may promise never again to underestimate rock Sylvania. They may describe their feet as though they have been tenderized by a moderately hostile kitchen staff. But later, distance softens tone. The state becomes one of those places that help define the trail by refusing to be conveniently enjoyable. It taught caution in footwear. It taught the difference between flat and easy. It taught that long ridges can be more annoying than large mountains. It taught that the body can withstand quite a lot of nonsense provided there is food at the end of the day, and ideally not too much more quartzite in between. And perhaps that is why even experienced hikers sometimes avoid certain Pennsylvania stretches, or at least prepare for them with more seriousness than the profile might seem to deserve. They know that this is not a place to float carelessly through on failing shoes and stale optimism. It is a place where pacing matters, where the body needs protecting, where rest can matter as much as strength, and where stubbornness is less useful than simple, practical sense. A hiker does not have to fear Pennsylvania in the same way one fears exposed alpine weather. What they often feel instead is a kind of preventive irritation, the knowledge that there are days ahead in which the trail will not be dramatic enough to inspire awe, and not gentle enough to let the body recover. That middle ground is surprisingly powerful. So Pennsylvania earns its reputation honestly, not because it is the highest or the most remote or the most technically difficult part of the Appalachian Trail, but because it turns repetitive roughness into a memorable form of trial. It bruises feet by making each mile a little less kind than it first appears. It bruises patience by doing this over and over again, often on ridges that seem as though they ought to be easier than they are. It offers moments of ease and history just often enough to keep a person emotionally engaged, then sends them back onto stone. And once a hiker has learned that hardship on the AT does not always arrive in Grand Mountain form, the trail is ready to change the terms again, because elsewhere the trouble is not a dry rocky argument under clear skies, but heavy forest, rising weather, old ridges, and the kind of darkening air that can make the whole landscape feel as though it is leaning in to listen. The Great Smoky Mountains answer with a different kind of pressure, not the open rocky severity of the White Mountains, not the puzzle box awkwardness of Mahoosuc Notch. The Smokies press inward instead. They gather around a hiker in layers of ridge, cloud, hardwood forest, damp air, and long, high walking that can feel far heavier than the map first suggests. Great Smoky Mountains National Park contains 74 miles of the Appalachian Trail, and that stretch runs through a park where elevations range from 876 to 6,643 feet, with an unbroken chain of peaks above 5,000 feet for more than 36 miles. The trail there is not wandering casually through low country with occasional scenic punctuation. It is spending serious time up high in a mountain system that holds weather, water, forest and visibility in a very unsettled balance. That is one reason hikers speak of the Smokies in such a particular tone. The danger here is not always concentrated into one famous obstacle. It is spread through atmosphere and duration. The Park Service says conditions can change quickly, that rain can occur daily through much of the year, that snow can fall into the end of May, and that lightning storms, high winds, and other weather hazards require hikers to stay alert and give themselves enough time to reach safety. On the park's weather page, the language is equally plain. Spring weather is unpredictable, and sunny skies can turn to snow flurries within a few hours. Even lower area weather tells only part of the story, because the park also warns that clear skies in lower elevations do not guarantee the same weather in the higher country. That is the Smokies in one sentence. What looks manageable from below may be something else entirely up on the crest. A great many hikers learn this lesson the hard way, not because they are foolish, but because the Smokies are unusually good at turning ordinary uncertainty into a full working environment. In many parts of the Appalachian Trail, a bad hour of weather remains an episode. In the Smokies, weather can begin to feel like a constant background force, one that never quite leaves the conversation. The park's own climate figures show how wet and unsettled the high country can be. In the Smokies high country, more than 85 inches of rain fall on average each year. At Kuohi, the park's highest point, average monthly precipitation stays high year-round, and winter snow totals there are substantial. This is not weather that occasionally interrupts the trail, it is weather that helps define the place. A hiker is not merely visiting a forest with storms, they are moving through a mountain system shaped by persistent moisture, steep elevation differences, and a sky that changes its mind without apology. Fog is part of that personality, and it is not just a visual flourish. The Smokies carry their own name honestly. Moisture gathers, clouds settle low, visibility narrows. The park's climate material notes that water and cloud cover matters deeply to these mountains, especially in the high elevation spruce fir forest, and the air profile material describes acidic clouds and fog covering high elevation forests at times. That tells you something important. Fog here is not occasional decoration pasted onto scenic overlooks for dramatic effect. It is part of the mountain ecology. For a hiker, that means the world can contract quickly. Distances flatten, ridges disappear, openings vanish. A trail that seemed simple on a clear morning can feel much heavier when the horizon drops away, and every tree emerges damp and close. The body keeps walking, but the mind begins working harder. It must. Fog takes away the reassuring sense that the day can be read at a glance. That narrowing of the world is one part of what gives the Smokies their weight. The woods here are not a thin strip of pleasant green. The Park Service describes mature hardwood forests stretching to the horizon and over 2,100 miles of streams and rivers feeding through the landscape. The forests are world-renowned for their biological diversity, and the mountains themselves are among the tallest in the Appalachian chain. All of that is wonderful on paper and often wonderful in person, but scale has emotional consequences. A dense, wet, high forest can begin to feel less like a backdrop and more like an enclosing system. Sounds shorten, light dulls, ridges repeat. The trail stays mainly on high elevation ridges through the park according to the ATC, which means hikers spend long periods moving not in and out of easy lowlands, but through elevated country where cold, wind and cloud matter more. The woods feel older there, deeper there, and much less interested in entertaining anybody's fantasies of a quick, pleasant crossing. This is where the Smokies differ from sections whose difficulty is easy to summarize. Pennsylvania hurts the feet. Mahoosuc Notch slows the body. The whites expose the hiker to alpine severity. The Smokies distribute hardship through mood, dampness, and repetition. You climb in forest. You descend in forest. You wake to mist. You watch the day remain grey. You hear water moving somewhere below. You study the sky for signs that the rain will either arrive fully or continue threatening to do so in a way that is, in its own way, even more irritating. The park notes that the trail crosses more than 36 miles of peaks, above 5,000 feet. An ATC emphasizes that hikers there need lots of layers and a 3-season sleeping bag. That is not because the park is trying to sound rugged in a brochure. It is because the high ridges of the Smokies demand a level of preparedness that casual expectations often fail to meet. Storms intensify everything. The park's safety guidance specifically calls out lightning storms and high winds, and the weather page warns that changes can be rapid. The water safety page adds another unsettling detail. A localized thunderstorm far upstream on the highest peaks can create sudden flood conditions at lower elevations, even where you did not feel a raindrop. That is exactly the kind of fact hikers remember, because it reveals how connected the mountains are. You're never dealing only with the weather directly above your head. You're dealing with what happened elsewhere on the range, what the terrain channels towards you, and what the trail asks you to cross after that happens. In a park full of streams, steep drainage, and fast-changing mountain weather, storms are not dramatic sideshows. They alter the whole calculation of movement and timing. A crossing that seemed manageable can become a bad idea. A ridge that seemed merely windy can become exposed at exactly the wrong hour. And because so much of the Appalachian Trail through the Smokies lies on those higher ridges, hikers cannot always solve the problem simply by ducking into lower, easier country. The route is the route. You stay with it, and the park's rules make that structure even firmer. Camping is only allowed at designated shelters and campsites, and for general backcountry permit holders, overnight stays tied to shelters require staying inside the shelter. Thru-hikers have a little more flexibility if a shelter is full, but even then the system is more controlled than in many other parts of the trail. That matters because it narrows a hiker's options on difficult days. In a looser landscape, a tired person might stop early or adjust more freely. In the Smokies, planning is more formal. There is a permit system, designated overnight places, and a route where the weather may not care that your reservation optimism was shaped 3 days ago under friendlier skies. Shelters, of course, sound comforting until you remember that comfort on the Appalachian Trail is a relative term. In the Smokies, they can feel both reassuring and restrictive. Reassuring because in cold rain or heavy fog, a roof is not a philosophical concept, but a direct improvement in life. Restrictive because having to aim for particular sites means the day can start to feel predetermined by terrain and regulation, rather than by your body's actual condition. Add in bare cables, required storage for odorous items, and a park where black bear activity is high enough that the park reports an average of 339 negative human bear encounters annually over the last decade, and the overnight mood becomes more complicated. Bear activity is especially high from May through August, the park says, and visitors are warned that safety is not guaranteed. Most hikes pass without serious bear trouble. Still, the knowledge is there. At the end of a foggy, wet, tiring day, the woods do not exactly feel lighter because one is carefully hanging lip balm and toothpaste on a cable system in bear country. That is another reason some hikers avoid this stretch, or at least postpone it when conditions look ugly. The Smokies are not merely hard in a physical sense. They can feel administratively heavy, emotionally heavy, and atmospherically heavy all at once. There is the permit. There are the designated overnights. There is the weather uncertainty. There are the long ridges. There are the bears. There is the constant moisture. There is the knowledge that even if the valley forecast seems harmless, the high country may be running an entirely different program. None of these problems alone is enough to explain the Smokies' reputation. Together they create a kind of pressure chamber. Everything still works. People still pass through. But the section asks for calm, patience and preparation in a way that can be exhausting when a hiker is already carrying weeks of accumulated trail fatigue. The psychological effect of that matters more than people outside hiking culture sometimes realize. Dense mountain woods can become oppressive not because they are ugly, but because they are repetitive under stress. The Smokies are beautiful, that is not in doubt. But beauty in wet cloud is a different experience from beauty in sunlight. Mature hardwood forest stretching to the horizon is lovely when you are warm and steady. It can feel quite another way when your socks have gone beyond wet into permanent affiliation with moisture. When every shelter conversation is about weather, and when the ridgeline ahead keeps disappearing into grey. A forest does not need to be threatening in a dramatic sense to become mentally tiring. It only needs to keep repeating itself while conditions remain unsettled. The weight of the woods is partly that repetition, ridge after ridge, tree after tree, damp air that seems to have no beginning and no intention of ending. It is worth remembering that the Smokies also sit in a very old mountain system with a long human history, one that the Park Service describes as spanning thousands of years. That depth adds to the feeling of seriousness even when hikers are not consciously thinking about it. This is not a newly manufactured recreation zone. It is a place of old ridges, old weather patterns, old forests, old settlements, and complicated human presence layered over time. The Appalachian Trail enters that larger setting for 74 miles and becomes only one path inside it. That can make a hiker feel small in a productive way, but it can also make the woods feel heavy with scale and history. In the Smokies, the trail does not dominate the landscape. It threads through a place that clearly existed long before backpackers began debating the merits of different instant mashed potatoes. For all these reasons, the Smokies often humble hikers who expected something simpler. They are not the park section to underestimate because the trail is famous, or the shelters are known, or the views are celebrated. The Park Service says weather can shift quickly. The ATC says the trail stays mainly on high ridges, and calls for layers and a 3-season sleeping bag. Camping is restricted to designated sites. Food and all scented items must be hung on the bear cable system. The mountains above 5,000 feet run for more than 36 miles along the crest. Rain is abundant in the high country. Fog and cloud are part of the place itself. Put together, those facts explain why this section feels heavier than many hikers expect. Not because every mile is technically brutal, but because the whole environment keeps pressing on the mind as well as the body. And that may be the clearest way to understand why even experienced hikers hesitate around the Smokies in bad weather or late season. They know that this is one of those trail sections where discomfort can become consequence quickly. They know that fog shortens the world, storms change crossings and ridges, bears require discipline, and shelter rules shape the day whether morale agrees or not. They know the woods can feel very large when visibility drops and the trail keeps to high country. The Smokies do not usually deliver one famous cinematic disaster. They deliver attrition of a more sophisticated kind: dampness, uncertainty, distance, repetition, wind, grey sky, the slow realization that a forest can be magnificent and still feel burdensome for hours at a time, and once that burden has settled on the shoulders long enough, the trail is ready with another lesson entirely, because not every dreaded section overwhelms with too much water, too much cloud, and too much forest. Sometimes the problem is the opposite: too little water, too much heat, and the long, dry arithmetic of wondering whether the next dependable source will still be there when you arrive. And this is where the trail changes the rules again, because not every dreaded stretch has a famous name painted onto it by generations of hikers. Some of the hardest miles on the Appalachian Trail are hard because of conditions rather than landmarks. They arrive when the springs shrink, the seeps fade, the ridges bake, and the day begins asking a very simple question over and over again. How much water do you have left? That question can turn an ordinary stretch of trail into something far more serious than it looked in the guidebook. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy says seasonal creeks and springs on the AT tend to dry up from late June through September, and that other sources can also dry up during drought in summer and fall. It adds that more hikers are finding water sources dry in summer and fall, especially sources labelled seasonal, and especially in the mid-Atlantic from West Virginia to New York. This kind of hardship is different from the dramatic sections people like to name and compare. There is no single hardest dry mile in the same way there is a hardest mile in Mahoosuc Notch. Heat and water scarcity move around. They shift by season, by rainfall, by elevation, by sun exposure, and by the simple bad luck of arriving a week after the springs have stopped cooperating. That makes them harder to romanticize and easier to underestimate. A person can prepare mentally for one brutal climb or one famous ridge. It is much harder to prepare for a whole period of hiking where each day begins with checking water notes, carrying extra weight, and hoping the next source still exists in a useful form instead of as a damp suggestion on a rock. The ATC's guidance is blunt about this. Do not rely on water caches, carry more water in hot weather and rugged terrain, and be especially cautious when there are more than 5 miles between sources. That last part matters more than people often realise. Water is safety, but water is also weight, and those two truths dislike each other. The Conservancy recommends having the ability to carry at least 2 litres of water, but also warns hikers to carry more in hot weather or when long gaps separate sources. So the hiker facing heat has to solve a very awkward equation. Carry too little and the day can turn dangerous. Carry a lot and the climb gets harder because every extra litre adds more than 2 pounds to the pack. The result is that dry weather changes not only hydration planning, but the entire feel of the hike. Packs feel heavier, pace slows, rest breaks matter more, and morale becomes tied to the next spring in a way that can make the trail feel less like a path and more like a sequence of liquid deadlines. Heat then takes that ordinary logistical stress and starts changing the body itself. The National Park Service says heat-related illnesses happen when the body cannot cool down properly, and that high humidity, high elevation, strenuous activity, dehydration and sunburn all increase the risk. The service also notes that these illnesses range from treatable problems like heat rash and sunburn to heat stroke, which can be fatal if not treated quickly. In other words, heat is not simply discomfort with a bad attitude. It is a physical process that can impair judgment, damage the body, and end a hike fast. A long trail like the AT is especially good at hiding the seriousness of this, because hikers are used to some level of daily tiredness. If fatigue feels normal, it becomes easier to miss the moment when fatigue has become heat illness instead. Humidity makes this much worse, and the eastern United States is not exactly shy about humidity. The Park Service says high humidity keeps sweat from evaporating as quickly, which means the body loses one of its main cooling methods just when strenuous activity is asking for more cooling than usual. That is a cruel little arrangement, because hikers often assume sweating means the system is working. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the body is sweating furiously and still failing to shed heat effectively because the air is already holding too much moisture. This is part of why hot days on the Appalachian Trail can feel heavier than the thermometer alone suggests. 85 degrees in dry air is one thing. 85 degrees in humid mountain air while climbing under a full pack is quite another. The body's not simply warm. It is trying and struggling to solve a cooling problem mile after mile. The Weather Service guidance on outdoor heat safety captures the practical side of this without much poetry. Drink plenty of water, whether you feel thirsty or not, it says, especially when hiking. Seek help fast if warning signs appear, including cramping, rapid pulse, heavy sweating, hot red skin, dizziness, confusion, nausea or vomiting. It also recommends sunscreen, light-coloured loose clothing, and even something as simple as a wet towel or bandana on the neck to help cool the body. That advice sounds almost plain to the point of being obvious, and yet obvious advice is often what hikers ignore first when the trail seems manageable enough. People push through. They want to make miles. They think the next patch of shade will fix things. They do not always notice how much slower and foggier their own thinking has become until the body's already in trouble. That mental fog is one of the most dangerous parts of hot, dry hiking. Heat does not always arrive with a dramatic announcement. It can begin as irritability, a slight headache, a strange lack of appetite, a feeling that the next climb is more offensive than usual. Then pace becomes harder to hold. Decisions become sloppier. Small route choices feel more annoying than they should. Breaks stretch longer. A person may feel both thirsty and reluctant to drink too much because they are worried about running out early, which is exactly the sort of logic heat stress likes to exploit. The Park Service notes that strenuous activity in hot weather makes it harder for the body to cool off, especially if a person is not used to exercising in those temperatures. On a long trail, where tiredness already exists in the background, that shift can be subtle and therefore easy to miss. Some of the worst heat-related misery on the AT comes not in midsummer itself, but in those deceptive shoulder periods when hikers are mentally prepared for spring or fall and do not quite respect what the day is doing. A TC's guidance for flip-flop hikers warns that mid-Atlantic ridge runners help dehydrated hikers on hot spring days each year, especially before the tree leaves have fully unfurled and hikers are more exposed to the sun. It also warns hikers not to underestimate the spring sun, and to stop or take a break rather than trying to push through the heat. That detail is worth noticing because it shows how the problem is not always wilderness in its grandest form. Sometimes it is timing. Sometimes it is sunlight hitting exposed ridges earlier in the season, while a hiker is still carrying cold weather assumptions in their head. This is one reason experienced hikers will occasionally avoid certain stretches at certain times, rather than treat the whole trail as one continuous challenge to be met, in whatever weather happens to show up. Avoidance, once again, is often a form of intelligence rather than fear. If a series of seasonal sources has been running low, if the forecast suggests hot, dry, windy weather, if local hikers are warning that comments are full of dry water reports, then skipping ahead, slowing down, or choosing a different schedule is not surrender. It is just practical sense. The ATC explicitly tells hikers to contact the local AT club or land manager about recent water source conditions and to consult crowdsourced information for near real-time updates. That kind of advice would not exist if the problem were theoretical. It exists because water availability changes enough that old assumptions can become bad planning very quickly. And bad planning in heat has a way of multiplying itself. If you start the day low on water, you may ration too early. Rationing too early can reduce performance. Reduced performance slows you down. Slowing down leaves you on exposed trail during hotter hours. Being on exposed trail during hotter hours means you drink more from the smaller supply you are trying to protect. By the time the next source appears, if it appears, the body may already be deep into the kind of fatigue that turns a simple refill into a full recovery operation. This is why the most dangerous hot days on trail are rarely about one mistake. They're about several small, reasonable-looking decisions lining up behind one another until the day tilts out of balance. The NPS heat illness guidance warns that even moderate problems can ruin a trip and may require a full day of rest or more. On a long trail, losing a day is not just inconvenient. It changes planning, morale, food, and confidence. There is also a social side to water scarcity that hikers know well. When sources are flowing, water is a routine. Filter, drink, move on. When sources are questionable, water becomes conversation. Everyone talks about it. Southbound hikers mention the next spring. Someone in camp says the seep before the shelter is barely running. Someone else says there is a piped spring half a mile off trail, but the comments were confusing. A person who would normally linger over dinner now starts doing arithmetic out loud with half a litre remaining and one dry camp between here and the next reliable source. That change in tone affects the whole emotional climate of the hike. The trail stops feeling open-ended and starts feeling managed by resource scarcity. The woods are still beautiful, but beauty becomes secondary when your attention keeps returning to the same bottle. ATC's water guidance reflects this reality directly by encouraging hikers to ask people coming the opposite way about water ahead. What makes this especially trying is that heat and low water often arrive in landscapes that are otherwise not the trail's most celebrated or famous. A hiker might be prepared to suffer nobly on a great mountain range. It is much harder to feel noble on a hot exposed ridge with dusty tread, patchy shade, and a spring that has turned into a rumour. There are stretches in the mid-Atlantic and the south where the challenge is not one enormous climb, but the long draining sameness of warm air, bright light, slow sweating, and uncertain refill points. ATC specifically notes that fall can bring especially dry weather through the South and Mid-Atlantic, and recommends carrying an extra quart, checking comments ahead, and watching for hot, dry, windy weather tied to fire conditions and burn bans. That advice captures something important. Heat and dryness on the trail are not isolated inconveniences. They are part of a broader landscape stress that can reshape how the whole hike feels. The body responds to that landscape stress in boring but important ways. Appetite often drops in heat, which means people eat less just when they need energy. Rest becomes harder because a hiker may reach camp overheated rather than usefully tired. Sleep in warm, still air can feel shallow and unsatisfying. Mornings start less refreshed. Then the next day repeats the pattern. The Park Service notes that dehydration itself increases the risk of heat illness, which turns every slightly under-recovered day into a setup for the next one. On a trail as long as the Appalachian Trail, cumulative stress is everything. Few hikers collapse in a single perfect drama. Many simply get ground down by a chain of lesser imbalances that eventually become one big one. Heat is very good at building those chains quietly. This is also why water planning on the AT is never just about carrying enough to avoid thirst. It is about carrying enough to preserve judgment. The Weather Service warns hikers to act quickly if symptoms of heat illness appear, including dizziness, confusion, nausea, or vomiting. But by the time confusion is noticeable, a person may already be making poorer choices than they realize. That is why so much official guidance sounds preventive rather than heroic. Drink early, carry enough, use shade, slow down. Do not wait for obvious crisis. The quiet discipline of hot weather hiking is less cinematic than a summit push in wild weather, but in many ways it is just as serious. A hiker who handles heat well may not have an impressive story afterward, and that is precisely the point. The best heat management often looks uneventful from the outside. In some parts of the trail, the most sensible adjustment is simply time of day. The weather guidance for outdoor heat stresses shade, hydration and caution during exertion, while the Smokies hiking safety page advises avoiding hiking during the hottest part of the day and taking regular breaks in shade. Many long-distance hikers already know this rhythm by instinct. Start earlier, use the cooler hours, ease off when the day becomes aggressive. But even that common sense has limits. If water is scarce, starting earlier means carrying more before sunrise. If the terrain is rugged, slowing down in heat may put camp farther away than planned. A trail is a system of compromises, and hot, dry conditions expose that very clearly. There is no perfect answer, only better and worse decisions made before the sun fully settles in. So when water runs low and heat settles in, the Appalachian Trail becomes difficult in a quieter, more portable way. No famous notch, no singular peak, no one dramatic obstacle everyone photographs and talks about for years. Instead, there is the weight of extra litres in the pack, the anxiety of seasonal sources, the flattening effect of humidity, the danger of underestimating spring sun, the slow erosion of patience, and the very ordinary fact that the human body performs worse when hot and underwatered. The Conservancy's guidance, the Park Service's warnings, and the Weather Service's symptom lists all point to the same truth. This is not side material. It is one of the core reasons even experienced hikers change plans, skip dry stretches in the wrong season, or treat certain sections with far more caution than the elevation profile seems to deserve. And after enough hot days, enough uncertain springs, and enough hours of negotiating with your own thirst, the trail starts taking something else as well. Not just water, not just energy, but the mental steadiness that makes a long walk feel purposeful. Because some of the sections hikers avoid are not defined by what the land does to the feet or the lungs, but by what the whole long process begins to do to the mind when the woods are quiet. The miles stop feeling fresh, and the company of your own thoughts becomes one more thing to manage. And after the trail is worn at the feet, the lungs, the knees, and the daily watermath, it begins taking something less visible, which is often harder to speak about clearly. A long trail does not only challenge the body, it narrows the world. It reduces life to movement, weather, food, shelter, and timing. And for many hikers, that simplicity is part of the appeal. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy has described the AT experience as one built around immersion in nature, simplicity, self-reliance, and physical beauty. And trail educators tied to the long-distance hiking community have explicitly treated the emotional and psychological side of a thru hike as necessary, not optional, for success. That matters because it tells you, from the trail's own world, that mental strain is not some dramatic extra laid on top of the hike after the real challenges are over. It is part of the real challenge. The quiet problem begins there, in the same qualities that attract people in the first place. Simplicity can be clarifying. Self-reliance can be satisfying. Immersion can feel clean and steady. But carried on for week after week, under fatigue and uncertainty, those same qualities can also make a person feel exposed in ways that are hard to explain to anyone who has not been alone in the woods for very long with nowhere urgent to look except inward. This can seem contradictory from the outside because time in nature is often genuinely good for the mind. American Hiking Society notes that spending time outdoors can positively affect mental well-being, and its nature-informed therapy piece describes natural settings as calming to the nervous system, supportive of lowered stress, and helpful for social connection, as well as personal regulation. That is all true, and hikers know it. A quiet forest can settle a racing mind in ways a waiting room never will. A ridge at first light can make ordinary worries look smaller and more manageable for a little while. But a thru hike is not a short restorative outing. It is prolonged exposure to uncertainty, discomfort, repetition, and self-management. The same forest that calms you on a Sunday afternoon can become emotionally difficult on day 62 if you are cold, underfed, carrying a small injury, and not sure whether you're truly enjoying yourself or merely too committed to stop. The trail does not stop being beautiful when this happens. It simply becomes clear that beauty and loneliness are not opposites, and neither are quiet and fear. Loneliness on the Appalachian Trail is also more complicated than people assume. From a distance, the trail can look highly social. There are shelters, trail towns, shared camps, and a steady language of trail names, resupply stories, weather rumours, and mutual complaints about route systems and footwear. Many hikers do find close companionship out there. Some move in little shifting groups for weeks at a time. Some find exactly the kind of community they had hoped for, but solitude is still built into the structure of the thing. The Forest Service advises hikers to travel in groups as much as possible and leave an itinerary with family or friends. Olympic National Park gives similar guidance, saying it is safer to hike with a companion, to leave an itinerary, and in bad weather like rain, snow or fog to stay put rather than force travel. Great Smoky Mountains. National Park adds the blunt reminder that backcountry travel has inherent risks, that rescue is not a certainty, and that hikers are responsible for their own safety. Those are all practical safety statements, but emotionally they point to the same truth. Even on a famous trail, there are long periods when no one is managing your day but you, and if your judgment slips or your spirits dip, the woods do not step in to compensate. That is often when loneliness changes shape. Early in a hike, solitude can feel chosen, almost luxurious. The phone is quiet. The obligations of ordinary life have been reduced. Meals are simple. Thoughts feel cleaner. Then the days stack up. The weather turns rough. A friend gets ahead or leaves the trail. The shelter you were aiming for is crowded with strangers or empty in a way that is somehow worse. You realise that you have not had an easy conversation with someone who really knows you in quite a while. Chosen solitude becomes something more uneven. It is not always dramatic sadness. Sometimes it is simply the lack of witness. No one sees how hard the day felt. No one understands why a tiny inconvenience became the final annoyance in a long chain. No one is there to tell you that you're still thinking clearly when your own judgment begins to feel slippery. That is why official backcountry guidance keeps stressing companions, itineraries, and realistic assessment. Solitude is not automatically dangerous, but it strips away the small social checks that help people stay steady. Fear enters through those gaps and not always through the things outsiders expect. The imagination likes bears, strange noises, and dramatic emergencies. Real trail fear is often much plainer. It begins with weather. The ATC warns that a cold rain can be one of the most dangerous conditions on the trail because it can cause hypothermia, even when temperatures are well above freezing, especially when wind, sweat, and wet clothing all combine. The same guidance warns that hot, humid conditions are common on the trail in summer, and that heavy exertion with a pack can lead to heat stroke or heat exhaustion if hikers do not take proper precautions. Olympics wilderness safety advice says that in rain, snow, and fog, a hiker may be safer staying put than trying to travel. None of that is theatrical. It is all ordinary enough to happen on what had looked, a few hours earlier, like a normal hiking day. Fear grows quickly in those conditions because it is rational. Your body starts reading the situation correctly before your pride catches up. The woods darken, the air cools, the trail disappears into wet grey, and the mind begins running faster than the feet. Then there is the quieter fear that arrives at dusk or in fog or in any moment when orientation thins out. The Smokies hiking safety guidance says rescue is not a certainty and tells hikers to stay on marked trails, leave a trip plan, and be prepared for swollen streams, washouts, downed trees, and erosion. Zion's Wilderness Guide, though about another park, makes the broader wilderness point very clearly. Safety in backcountry travel depends on good judgment, adequate preparation, and constant observation, and people should be prepared to spend an unexpected night out because rescue may not be certain. The reason these agencies sound so repetitive is that fear on a trail often begins exactly when those three things start to wobble. Judgment goes first, then attention, then confidence. A person who felt perfectly competent at noon can feel startlingly unsure by evening if visibility drops. The route feels less obvious, and the day has already used up more energy than planned. At that point, the problem is no longer only terrain. It is the mind trying not to outrun the facts. Trail fatigue makes that mental balance harder to keep. Long-distance hikers sometimes talk about fatigue as though it belongs only to the legs, but fatigue is a full-system problem. Mount Rainier National Park's climbing guidance states the principle in a direct way that applies far beyond climbing. Proper conditioning can offset the effects of fatigue that lead to mistakes and injuries. Zion's Wilderness Guide again emphasizes that safety depends on judgment and preparation. The backcountry does not require a person to collapse dramatically in order to become dangerous. It only needs that person to become a little slower, a little foggier, a little more careless about details. On the Appalachian Trail, that may mean forgetting to eat enough, pushing too far toward the next shelter, missing a turn in poor light, treating a small blister too late, or deciding that weather is probably fine because stopping would be inconvenient. Trail fatigue is dangerous partly because it so rarely feels dramatic from inside. It feels ordinary. You feel tired because you have been hiking. You feel dull because it has been a long week. You feel impatient because the terrain is annoying. And in that perfectly believable state, the quality of your choices can begin quietly to fall. That decline in judgment is one reason the mental side of the trail can become so oppressive even when nothing has gone visibly wrong. There are days when the hiker is not in crisis, not injured, not truly lost, not in immediate danger, and still everything feels a little off. The pack feels heavier than it should. The next shelter feels farther than the mileage suggests. The forest seems to repeat itself without offering any real sense of progress. Conversation, if there is any, feels flatter. Food is less interesting. Small decisions become irritating. This is the middle ground where trail fatigue lives. Not disaster, but depletion. Not one catastrophe, but a steady reduction in enthusiasm and tolerance. The trail community itself recognizes this in its own way. A TC's materials describing successful long-distance hiking explicitly mention emotional and psychological aspects, not just fitness and gear. That is a quiet admission that on a trail this long, managing the mind is not decorative. It is part of the work. Fear and loneliness also feed each other. A person hiking alone through ordinary woods in ordinary weather may feel perfectly calm. That same person, after several poor nights of sleep, a near miss on wet rock, and an afternoon of cold drizzle, may begin hearing the woods differently. Sounds seem closer, distances feel less trustworthy. The dark arrives with more authority. Nothing in the forest has necessarily changed. The hiker has. Fatigue makes the nervous system louder. That is one reason nature can be both soothing and unsettling depending on context. American Hiking Society's mental health guidance says nature can regulate the body, reduce stress, and even help build a bridge toward human connection, especially in group settings. But it also emphasizes the power of relationship and shared experience. When those are absent, the same natural setting can stop feeling like support and start feeling like a mirror held too close. The trail strips away distractions, which is often useful, but it also strips away buffers. If a person is grieving, anxious, homesick, uncertain, or simply worn thin, the woods do not drown that out. They amplify the space around it. There is another kind of fear too, the kind that does not present as fear at all. It presents as the sudden urge to quit after lunch on a day that is merely mediocre. It presents as resentment toward a mountain that is not especially steep. It presents as a deep conviction that the next town will solve everything. Sometimes the next town helps. Sometimes a shower, a meal, and a night indoors truly do restore a person enough to keep moving well. But sometimes what the hiker is calling boredom or frustration is really accumulated stress asking for a different level of attention. The trail has a way of disguising emotional needs as logistical ones. More calories will help, certainly. So will dry socks. So will sleep. But there are moments when what is actually failing is something quieter. A sense of connection to the hike itself. The confidence that the effort still makes sense. The emotional reason for continuing. That is why loneliness can be so dangerous on a long trail, even when the hiker is technically competent. It makes the whole project harder to carry, and yet the answer is not to treat this mental strain as proof that the hike has failed, or that wilderness is somehow false in its promises. It is almost the opposite. The quiet problem exists because the trail is doing exactly what it does best. It simplifies life enough that the mind can no longer hide behind ordinary noise. The AT experience, as ATC describes it, includes simplicity and self-reliance. Those can be powerful gifts. They can also become demanding disciplines. Simplicity leaves less room to distract yourself. Self-reliance leaves less room to outsource judgment. Immersion in nature leaves less room to pretend you are unaffected by weather, hunger, fear, or loneliness. The trail becomes a steady test of whether you can remain gentle with yourself while still being honest about your limits. Official safety language keeps returning to the same practical points for this reason. Know your limitations, choose the right trail, leave an itinerary, turn back if needed, stay put in bad weather. These are not only safety rules, they're also forms of psychological discipline. They ask a hiker to remain factual when the mind most wants to be emotional. What experienced hikers learn, sometimes slowly, is that trail fatigue cannot always be beaten by toughness. Toughness is useful for getting through a hard climb or a cold morning. It is less useful against a month of poor sleep, repetitive discomfort, weather stress, and private uncertainty. In those cases, the more important skills are often pacing, companionship, rest, food, honesty, and the willingness to interrupt a bad pattern before it becomes a crisis. The official advice to hike with companions when possible, leave trip plans, and treat judgment as part of safety exists, because humans do better in the backcountry when they are not forced to carry every burden alone. Even those who do hike solo successfully often rely on a larger web of contact and caution. Messages sent before and after sections, weather checks, shelter conversations, trail towns, and the quiet reassurance that someone somewhere knows the general shape of their movement. Self-reliance does not have to mean isolation. On a trail this long, the difference matters. So the quiet problem on the Appalachian Trail is not a side note. It is one of the central reasons certain stretches become dreaded, skipped, or remembered with unusual intensity. Loneliness can turn a normal evening into a hard one. Fear can make a foggy ridge feel heavier than its elevation. Trail fatigue can erode judgment without announcing itself clearly. The trail's own institutions recognize that the hike demands emotional and psychological resilience. Wilderness agencies keep insisting that safety depends on preparation, judgment, realistic self-assessment, and sometimes the simple wisdom to stop moving. Nature can calm the mind, yes. It can also leave a person very alone with that mind for a very long time. That is why even experienced hikers do not always avoid sections only because they are rocky or steep or wet. Sometimes they avoid them because they know what prolonged effort in the wrong conditions can do to attention, courage, and morale. And once the trail has shown how much of the struggle happens inside the hiker rather than under the boots, one last question begins to matter more than any single mountain or state line. Because the real distinction is no longer between beginners and veterans, but between people who still think the trail rewards pure stubbornness and those who have learned why so many skilled walkers quietly choose, at certain moments, to go around rather than straight through. This is the point where the trail stops being a test of stubbornness and starts becoming a test of judgment. People who do not know the Appalachian Trail very well sometimes imagine that the strongest hikers are the ones who force themselves through every problem exactly as it appears, one white blaze after another, no matter the conditions, no matter the cost. The trail's own rules say otherwise. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy's 2,000-miler policy explicitly allows substitutions in emergencies, including blue blaze trails, officially required detours, road walks, and even shuttle or other transportation when no safe walking option exists. The ATC also says hikers who skip around closed or impassable sections because of emergency conditions can still qualify for recognition, and it frames the whole thing as an honour system based on an honest effort to walk the trail rather than a rigid obsession with passing every single white blaze under every possible circumstance. That tells you something very important straight away. Experienced hikers go around certain sections because the trail itself and the people charged with protecting it understand that safety and honest judgment matter more than theatrical purity. That may sound less romantic than the old image of the lone hiker marching forward through every obstacle, but romance is exactly what gets stripped away first on a long trail. A veteran walker does not usually think, "I am skipping this section because I am weak." They think, "This crossing is unsafe, that closure is real, those conditions will still be bad tomorrow, and there is no virtue in turning a manageable hike into a rescue story." The ATC's guidance on rivers and streams is unusually direct because it has to be. It says river and stream crossings are among the most dangerous challenges on the AT, that hikers have died in stream crossings during major rainstorms, and that when a crossing looks unsafe, the correct response is to wait, turn around, or seek an alternate route. It also notes that in places like New Hampshire and Maine, unbridged crossings can become impassable after major storms or spring snowmelt. In that light, going around is not a failure of nerve. It is exactly the response the trail's safety guidance recommends. The same logic applies to fire, flood, and storm damage, and this is one of the main reasons experienced hikers still walk around certain sections even when they are physically capable of walking through them on a better day. The ATC's wildfire guidance says hikers should check for wildfire-related warnings and closures before leaving, and should evacuate quickly, even if that means taking a side trail or backtracking, because a wildfire can spread much faster than a human can run. The ATC's trail updates page adds that backcountry conditions change constantly, and that it is the hiker's responsibility to be prepared for the unexpected. As of March 28, 2026, that updates page was carrying current wildfire risk and burn ban alerts in several states, along with other active trail-wide cautions. This is not an abstract theoretical problem. It is the ordinary modern condition of a long trail passing through changing weather, active land management, and a landscape that does not remain stable, simply because a hiker has a schedule in mind. Major storm damage makes the point even more clearly. The ATC's Hurricane Helene information for 2026 hikers says, the storm caused widespread catastrophic destruction in the southern Appalachians in late September 2024, and that closures and detours remained in effect as of March 5th, 2026. In other words, some sections can stay disrupted long after the dramatic weather itself has passed. A hiker may arrive months later and still be dealing with washouts, reroutes, unstable ground, damaged infrastructure, or official closures that exist partly to protect both people and recovering land. This is the sort of reality that changes how experienced hikers think. They stop treating the trail as a static object. They treat it as a living corridor with changing hazards, current management needs, and conditions that must be checked rather than assumed. Walking around a section in that context is not evasion. It is simply what a person does when they understand that yesterday's guidebook and last year's trail story are not enough. There is another reason skilled hikers go around certain sections, and it has less to do with emergencies than with timing. They have learned that the most efficient way to respect the trail is often to avoid the worst combination of season and terrain before it becomes a problem. This is one reason the ATC actively promotes flip-flop hikes. Its official guidance says flip-flop itineraries can offer milder weather, a longer time frame for completion, moderate terrain to start on, and reduced overcrowding. Its thru-hiker FAQs say hikers increasingly start in the middle of the trail to avoid crowds, reduce exposure to extremes of temperature, and begin in more beginner-friendly terrain. The language is practical rather than heroic, which is exactly the point. Experienced hikers are often less interested in doing the trail in the most traditional-looking way than in doing it in the way that gives the best chance of staying safe, healthy, and sane across 5 to 7 months of walking. The details of those flip-flop plans reveal how strategic that avoidance can be. ATC's recommended itineraries openly describe avoiding the crowded spring bubble, avoiding the worst heat in the mid-Atlantic, reaching New England in more favourable weather, and giving hikers plenty of time to reach Katahdin before mid-October. One itinerary even highlights the benefit of hiking the mid-Atlantic before it gets hot, humid, and dry enough for water sources to become scarce. Another emphasizes starting in moderate terrain and building trail legs before reaching Pennsylvania's rocks, and the climbs farther north that require the use of hands. That is worth noticing because it shows that experienced hikers do not merely detour after trouble arrives. They often avoid certain sections at certain times on purpose, long before anything goes wrong, because they know the trail is easier to manage when you respect its seasonal patterns instead of trying to out-stubborn them. This is also where experience becomes less glamorous and more mechanical. People who have actually spent long periods on the trail understand that preserving the body matters more than winning little private arguments with a map. If a route choice lets you build strength before Pennsylvania's rocky ridges, or hit New Hampshire before snowmelt turns the footing treacherous, or avoid the mid-Atlantic during peak heat and low water season, that is not taking the easy way out. That is load management. Athletes do it. Mountaineers do it. Good long-distance hikers do it too. A TC's guidance for flip-flops specifically warns that faster hikers should not start too early from Harper's Ferry, if that would send them into Vermont before mud season ends, or into New Hampshire when snow and snowmelt can make conditions treacherous. The point is not to prove you can suffer in bad timing. The point is to arrange the hike so that normal trail difficulty remains difficult, rather than needlessly upgraded into something uglier by season and chance. Crowding is another reason experienced hikers quietly walk around sections, or, more accurately, around particular timing windows. This is not just about personal preference. The ATC says flip-flop itineraries help conserve the trail by reducing overcrowding, and its FAQs say crowding at the southern end in spring contributes to resource damage, campsite expansion, and strain on shelters and surrounding land. The same FAQs explain that AT Camp helps hikers spread out their start dates and sign up for updates while on the trail, so when an experienced hiker avoids the Georgia start bubble or chooses a later or different starting point, they are not merely seeking peace and quiet, they are also reducing pressure on the corridor itself. That is a very trail veteran way of thinking. The goal shifts from "I must do this in the most recognizable way" to "I want to do this in a way that works for me and does less damage to the trail and the communities around it." Then there are the places where rules and management decisions are part of the reason hikers route around, split up or postpone certain sections. The Appalachian Trail is not one uninterrupted piece of identical public land. It crosses many jurisdictions, and some of the most sensitive or high-use areas have their own permit systems and operating rules. The ATC says there is no single trail-wide permit, and that hikers must obtain separate permits for Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Shenandoah National Park, and Baxter State Park. Baxter, in particular, operates under a wilderness-first management system. Its own rules say all long-distance hikers must obtain permits in person before attempting Katahdin, that permits are first-come, first-served, that the Birch's long-distance hiker site is limited to 12 people a night, and that Katahdin trails may be closed at any time during the hiking season because of weather and trail conditions. These are not minor administrative footnotes. They shape real decisions. A hiker who looks at weather, timing, permits, and capacity, and decides to flip, wait, or rearrange is not dodging the trail. They are working with the actual trail as it exists rather than the simpler version they may have imagined from home. Katahdin is a particularly good example because it shows how little the end of the trail cares about sentiment. The ATC says northbound hikers must plan to reach Katahdin before Baxter closes the trail to the summit in mid-October. and Baxter itself says the summit should strongly be completed before October 15th, because shoulder season closures are a regular reality. The park also says summer camping ends after October 22nd, and that trails, including the Hunt Trail, may close temporarily at any time during the hiking season due to weather and conditions. An experienced hiker looking at that situation does not treat it as some dramatic final exam that must be passed regardless of timing. They treat it as a moving target shaped by weather, capacity, and wilderness management. That is one reason flip-flop plans are so attractive to many veterans. A TC's own suggested itineraries include not worrying about Katahdin closing in mid-October as a benefit. When official planning advice frames relief from end-of-season pressure as an advantage, it becomes very hard to argue that the truest hikers are the ones who refuse strategic rerouting on principle. A great many experienced hikers also walk around certain sections because they no longer confuse danger with depth. This is one of the biggest differences between first-time romanticism and trail-earned judgment. A difficult climb in decent conditions can be meaningful, satisfying, and worth doing. A flooded crossing after a major storm, a wildfire closure, an unstable storm, damaged hillside, or a ridge under active severe weather is not more authentic. It is simply more random. Great Smoky Mountains. National Parks hiking guidance says hikers should know the difficulty of a route, check hazards and closures, be weather ready, and have a plan B if conditions are not suitable. That phrase, Plan B, contains a great deal of wisdom. People with less experience tend to think a backup plan means you lack commitment. People with more experience understand that a backup plan is what lets commitment survive contact with reality. The trail is still there tomorrow. A damaged knee, a rescue, or a death in bad water is not improved by moral certainty. There is a quieter reason too, and it lives in the difference between finishing a section and finishing a hike. Beginners often think in miles. Veterans think in continuity. If forcing one hazardous or badly timed section is likely to wreck the larger journey, then the smart choice may be to go around it now and preserve the rest of the hike. ATC's recognition policy makes room for exactly that kind of thinking. It says issues of sequence, direction, speed, and even whether one carries a pack are not the central question. It also says hikers affected by the 2024 Helen closures could suspend their hikes, resume later, and still be recognised, provided they completed the remaining trail within the allowed time frame. That is an institutional way of saying something experienced hikers already know in their bones. The larger journey matters more than one uncompromising week. Sometimes saving the hike means interrupting the line. Sometimes respecting the trail means leaving it for a while. This is why the phrase "walk around" can be a little misleading, even though it is true. Often what hikers are really doing is choosing the form of contact that makes sense under the circumstances. They may detour around a closure. They may use a required road walk. They may flip north and come back south. They may wait for water to drop. They may re-enter later in a safer season. They may start from Harper's Ferry or Shenandoah instead of Georgia. They may decide that the mid-Atlantic in cooler weather is more sensible than the same miles in punishing summer heat. They may avoid peak crowding because they know crowded campsites and overused shelters are harder on both land and morale. All of those choices are visible in ATC's official planning materials. They are not fringe improvisations. They are built into how the modern Appalachian Trail is actually hiked and managed. So the reason experienced hikers still walk around certain sections is not mysterious at all. It is because experience changes what the trail means. At first, people think the route is a line to be obeyed. Later, they understand it is a long negotiation among land, weather, rules, timing, conservation, health, and judgment. The strongest hikers are not always the ones who refuse to bend. Very often they are the ones who know exactly when to bend, when to wait, when to reroute, when to skip, and when to come back. They understand that the trail is not rewarding blind loyalty to a paint mark. It is rewarding attention. And once that sinks in, the whole Appalachian Trail begins to look a little different. Less like a pure endurance myth, more like a long lesson in respect, where what matters most is not whether a person forced every moment on the trail's terms, but whether they learned how to meet the trail honestly, without vanity, and without pretending that admiration alone is enough. And that, in the end, may be the clearest way to understand the Appalachian Trail. It is not best met with romance alone. Romance gets people to the trailhead. Romance buys the guidebook, studies the maps, imagines the views, and pictures a long, clean line through the mountains that will somehow sort out life by the simple method of requiring a great deal of walking. Romance is not useless. It is often how good things begin. But if romance is all a person brings to the Appalachian Trail, the trail will correct that very quickly. What it asks for instead is respect. Respect for weather, respect for water, respect for timing, respect for closures, respect for the body when it is strong, and even more respect for it when it is tired. The trail itself, or more precisely, the people and organizations who care for it, says this plainly. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy does not treat the route as a sacred line that must be followed blindly no matter what. Its 2,000-miler policy allows emergency substitutions such as blue blaze trails, required detours, road walks, and transportation when conditions make a section unsafe or impassable, and it frames completion around honest effort rather than rigid purity. ATC also actively promotes flip-flop itineraries because they can offer milder weather, moderate terrain to start, a longer time frame, and reduced overcrowding on the trail. That is not the language of a culture demanding thoughtless suffering. It is the language of a culture that has learned, through long experience, that judgment matters more than theatre. That distinction is worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes almost everything about how the trail should be understood. There is an old temptation, especially around difficult places, to imagine that the truest hiker is the one who never bends, never reroutes, never delays, never goes around. But the real trail does not reward that kind of vanity for long. Water sources dry up in summer and fall, especially seasonal ones, and ATC says hikers are increasingly finding them dry during those periods. River and stream crossings become dangerous enough that ATC warns hikers have died during major rainstorms, and says plainly that when in doubt people should wait, turn around, or seek another route. Baxter State Park can close Katahdin trails due to weather and trail conditions, and the park's rules and timing windows shape the end of a through hike whether a hiker likes it or not. A person can call this inconvenient, but the more honest word is real. Reality is often less dramatic than trail legend, and more demanding than trail legend at the same time. That is one of the things the Appalachian Trail does so well. It turns large dreams into small practical questions. Do you have enough water? Did you check the weather? Are you carrying the right layers? Are you tired in the ordinary way or in the way that begins making you careless? Is this crossing safe? Is that closure still in effect? ATC's official weather guidance says hikers may need 3 quarts or more of water in hot conditions and should plan conservatively when the heat index is high. It's hiker resources stress-checking current water conditions and planning ahead rather than assuming old information will still be true. These are not glamorous concerns. Nobody makes a grand speech to themselves before filtering from a muddy spring or deciding to cut a day short because the ridge is hotter than expected. And yet this is the substance of trail respect. It is built out of ordinary disciplined choices made before the day has a chance to become memorable for the wrong reasons. A great many people love the Appalachian Trail because it seems to offer a cleaner version of life. Walk north, walk south. Carry what you need, eat when hungry, sleep when tired. Let the woods simplify things. There is truth in that. The appeal is real. Simplicity is part of the trail's power. But simplicity does not mean softness. In many ways, it means the opposite. It means there are fewer distractions between you and the consequences of your choices. If you carry too little water, there is no polite urban backup system stepping in. If you ignore a bad forecast, the ridge receives that decision directly. If you keep walking when your body is already telling you the day has gone wrong, the trail does not negotiate kindly on your behalf. That is why experience so often produces humility instead of swagger. The longer people spend out there, the less interested they become in proving themselves to a line on a map. And that may be one of the healthiest lessons hidden inside all those avoided sections. The hard places on the Appalachian Trail are not merely there to hurt people or to sort the strong from the weak. They are there, more quietly, to teach proportion. Some things are worth pushing through, some are not. Some kinds of suffering build skill, confidence, and memory. Other kinds are random, unnecessary, and expensive. A steep climb in good conditions may be hard in a useful way. A dangerous stream crossing in flood is hard in a foolish way. A long dry ridge with uncertain water may deserve an early start and careful planning. A wildfire closure deserves obedience, not debate. A TC's own wildfire guidance says hikers should check for warnings and closures before leaving and evacuate quickly if needed, even if that means taking a side trail or backtracking. Respect means understanding that the trail is not less meaningful because you met it intelligently. It is more meaningful because you did. There is also something quietly freeing about that. Once you stop treating the trail as a morality test, it becomes easier to see it clearly. A reroute is not a stain on character. A postponed summit is not betrayal. A flip-flop start is not a lesser form of devotion. The ATC promotes flip-flops precisely because they can reduce overcrowding, offer more moderate terrain at the start, and avoid some of the worst seasonal extremes. That official encouragement matters because it shows the trail community at its wisest is not obsessed with performance for its own sake. It is interested in long-term stewardship, viable hiking plans, and keeping people alive long enough to enjoy what they came for. Sometimes the smartest trail move is still a hard move. Sometimes the smartest move is a very boring one, like checking the latest conditions and deciding the mountain can wait. Both belong to the same ethic, and perhaps that is why the Appalachian Trail remains so compelling. It is not only beautiful, and it is not only difficult. It is educational in a way that reaches beyond the obvious skills. Yes, it teaches foot placement, camp routine, weather awareness, and how much food a person can consume while still claiming to be reasonable. But it also teaches a more useful form of seriousness. It teaches that admiration without preparation is flimsy. It teaches that endurance without flexibility becomes brittle. It teaches that land should not be approached as scenery first and system second. The mountains, streams, ridges, shelters, storms, closures, and dry stretches are all part of one living corridor, and that corridor does not exist to perform a drama for hikers. People step into it briefly. It remains. Even the ending of the trail reflects that. Baxter State Park, where many northbound hikers meet Katahdin, limits access, requires permits for long-distance hikers, and may close summit trails because of weather and conditions. The mountain does not operate as a symbolic finish line first and a mountain second. It is a mountain first. That fact feels almost perfect. After thousands of miles, the trail still insists on the same lesson. You do not arrive so deserving that weather stops mattering. You do not get so close that rules become optional. You do not earn exemption from ordinary mountain truth simply because you have come a very long way. The end of the trail still asks for respect. That may be the most honest closing gesture it could possibly make. So when people say that even hikers avoid certain sections, what they really mean is that hikers who know the trail well have learned to separate courage from performance. They know the difference between a hard day worth having and a bad decision dressed up as dedication. They know that the Appalachian Trail is not diminished by detours, weather weights, changed plans, or strategic starts. If anything, those choices reveal a deeper kind of commitment because they show a willingness to meet the trail as it actually is rather than as a personal myth. The myth says keep going no matter what. Respect says pay attention. The myth says the straight line is pure. Respect says the living world is under no obligation to cooperate with your itinerary, and there is something very human in that. Most of life is not conquered by dramatic declarations. Most of life is handled through adjustment, patience, and small, clear-eyed decisions made before pride gets in the way. The Appalachian Trail, for all its size and legend, turns out to operate by much the same principle. The people who do best on it are not always the fastest, the loudest, or the most publicly determined. Very often they are the ones who keep looking carefully. They notice what the day is becoming. They notice what their bodies are saying. They notice when a dream needs to be modified in order to survive contact with weather, terrain, and time. That is not weakness. It is competence with humility attached. And maybe that is the right feeling to end with tonight. Not fear of the trail, not disillusionment, certainly not cynicism. The Appalachian Trail deserves admiration. It deserves wonder. It deserves every kind word people say about its forests, ridges, history, and strange ability to draw people into a simpler relationship with effort. But it deserves something steadier than romance by itself. It deserves the kind of attention that carries extra water when the sources are uncertain. The kind of patience that waits out the crossing when the stream is too high. The kind of honesty that says these rocks, this weather, this body, this day are not to be argued with. The kind of wisdom that understands going around is sometimes part of going through. So if you ever find yourself thinking about the Appalachian Trail, whether as a future hike, a distant dream, or simply a place you like to imagine from the safety of home, perhaps that is the best way to picture it. Not as a shining test meant to be beaten, and not as a gentle woodland promise, but as a long, real path through real mountains. Beautiful, yes. Historic, certainly. Worthy of deep affection, absolutely. But also changeable, physical, and entirely unimpressed by fantasy. A trail best met by listening first. And now, dear listener, we have come to the end of this long walk together. We started with a famous trail and a simple question about why some of its sections are avoided, and somewhere along the way we crossed into harder truths about weather, terrain, water, fatigue, fear, and the plain practical wisdom that experienced hikers carry like invisible gear. If you're still awake, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight, and what the world outside looks like where you are. Is it quiet? Is it raining? Is it warm? Is there a line of trees beyond the window, or only the dark shine of the street? Funny, isn't it? After so much talk of miles and mountains, we end again in a single small place, with one body at rest and one moment to notice. If this slow journey through the Appalachian Trail gave you some calm, some company, or just a gentler way to think about hard places, I would be ever so grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and shared it with someone else who might enjoy drifting off while learning why even famous paths are best approached with a little humility. For now, rest well, stay warm, and wherever your own road leads, may you meet it with more respect than romance, and just enough romance to begin.